Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the annals of exploration, few questions burn as brightly as this. Why did the Vikings, the most feared seafarers of the early medieval world, abandon a fertile new continent after successfully establishing a beachhead there around the year 1000 AD? The story of Vinland, the land of wild grapes and self-sown wheat, is normally celebrated as a tale of daring discovery, a triumphal moment when Leif Erikson and his crew became the first Europeans to set foot on North American soil. But the deeper, more perplexing tale is the one that follows the initial landfall, the rapid, almost panicked withdrawal that left the vast territories of the New World untouched by European hands for another 5 centuries. The sagas, our primary written sources, hint at the reasons: violent encounters with the indigenous people the Norse called Skrælings, internal discord among the settlers, and the sheer immensity of the ocean that separated Vinland from the nearest Norse base in Greenland. Yet these hints only scratch the surface. The real answer to the question of the abandonment is a complex tapestry woven from threads of military defeat, demographic fragility, economic miscalculation, environmental mismatch, and cultural rigidity. To understand it, we must move beyond the romantic image of the Viking warrior and see the Vinland colonists for what they really were: a tiny, privately financed group of farmers and traders operating at the very edge of their civilization's logistical and demographic capacity. The first paragraph of this opening chapter frames the central mystery and sets the stakes. The abandonment of Vinland was not a foregone conclusion. It was a decision, a series of decisions made by specific individuals under specific pressures, and those decisions reverberated through history, delaying the European colonization of the Americas by 500 years and allowing the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands to continue their own trajectories of development. We will scrutinize every factor, from the number of sheep and cows the Norse brought to the number of arrows the Skrælings could loose in a minute, to answer the question: Por qué els neo ficaram? Why didn't they stay? The context of the Vinland voyages is essential for understanding the subsequent retreat. The Norse expansion across the North Atlantic was a remarkable, multi-generational process that saw settlers leapfrog from the fjords of western Norway to the Shetland Islands, the Faroes, Iceland, and finally Greenland, where Eric the Red established a colony in the 980s. Each of these leaps was driven by a combination of population pressure, the search for arable land, political exile, and the restless ambition of chieftains seeking new domains. Greenland, however, was a marginal environment even during the medieval warm period. Its narrow strip of habitable coastal land offered limited pasture, no timber for shipbuilding, and a short growing season that made grain farming unreliable. The Greenland Norse were therefore dependent on imports from Europe and on the hunting of walrus for ivory, which they traded for iron, timber, and grain. When Leif Erikson returned from Vinland with reports of a land where grapes grew wild, where salmon swam thick in the rivers, and where timber, the precious building material, stretched to the horizon, the Greenlanders must have felt that they had found the solution to all their problems. Vinland was not just a discovery, it was a lifeline, a land of plenty that could complement and sustain the precarious Greenland outpost. The second paragraph of this chapter details this economic and demographic background, using population estimates of the Greenland settlements, no more than 2,500 souls at their peak, to illustrate just how tiny the pool of potential Vinland colonists was. The entire Norse population of the North Atlantic would not have filled a modern football stadium, and from this small pool, only a fraction could be spared for a risky transatlantic venture. This demographic reality is the first key to understanding the abandonment. There were simply not enough Norse to sustain a colony on the far side of the ocean, especially if that colony encountered resistance. The initial voyages to Vinland, led first by Leif Erikson around the year 1000 and then by his brother Thorvald, his sister-in-law Gudrid's husband Karlsefni, and the formidable Freydis Eiriksdottir, are recounted in 2 main saga texts: the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These texts, compiled in Iceland in the 13th century from oral traditions, are the only written accounts we have, and they are fraught with contradictions, literary embellishments, and a clear Christian editorial bias. According to the sagas, Leif's expedition was a simple reconnaissance that encountered no native inhabitants. allowing him to return to Greenland with a shipload of timber and grapes, painting a picture of an empty paradise ripe for the taking. This peaceful first contact created a dangerously optimistic set of expectations that would be shattered when subsequent expeditions ran headlong into the Skrælings. The third paragraph of this chapter dissects the saga accounts, pointing out that Leif's peaceful experience was likely an anomaly of timing or location, and that the later expeditions under Thorfinn Karlsefni quickly discovered the true nature of Vinland, a land already occupied by a determined, numerous, and militarily capable population. The sagas themselves, with their tales of Thorvald's death from a Skræling arrow and the great battle that sent Karlsefni's men fleeing in panic, are essentially the story of how paradise turned into a nightmare. Reading between the lines, we can see the saga authors grappling with the cognitive dissonance of a failed colonization, a land so rich, yet so impossible to hold. The military dimension of the Vinland failure is impossible to ignore. The Skrælings, likely belonging to the Dorset Paleo-Eskimo culture or ancestral Beothuk and Mi'kmaq populations, were not passive victims waiting to be displaced. They were skilled hunters and warriors who quickly recognized the Norse presence as a threat and responded with coordinated, large-scale attacks. The sagas describe the Skrælings arriving in fleets of skin boats, wielding bows and slings, and employing a terrifying noisemaker, a whirring stick or bull roarer, that unnerved even veteran Norse fighters. Thorfinn Eriksson was killed by an arrow in one of the first skirmishes, a clear signal that the Norse weapons, though made of iron, did not guarantee invincibility. The fourth paragraph of this chapter analyzes the military balance of power, emphasizing that the Norse were not a professional army but a small group of settlers, outnumbered by an enemy that knew the terrain, could strike from concealment, and could sustain losses that the Norse could not replace. The simple arithmetic of attrition doomed the colony. Every Norse casualty was a permanent loss, while the Skrælings could absorb losses and return. This was not a war the Norse could win, and Karlsefni, the leader of the most ambitious settlement attempt, realized this with the clarity of a merchant calculating a balance sheet. Beyond the battlefield, the Norse settlements suffered from a profound ecological and cultural mismatch with the Vinland environment. The Norse agricultural package, cattle, sheep, goats, and the associated need for large-scale haymaking and fixed pastures, was ill-suited to a region where the native subsistence system was based on mobility, marine hunting, and seasonal resource pulses. The Norse livestock damaged the local ecosystem, trampled salmon streams, and competed with the caribou that the Skrælings hunted. The famous incident of the bull, whose bellowing terrified the Skrælings during a trading session and may have triggered the first battle, is a symbol of this ecological incompatibility. The fifth paragraph of this chapter explores the environmental friction, using paleo-environmental data and modern ecological studies to argue that the Norse colony was an invasive species that the native ecosystem, and the people who depended on it, actively rejected. The Skræling resistance can thus be seen not just as a military campaign but as an ecological immune response, a rejection of a foreign body that threatened the integrity of the coastal landscape. Finally, the internal social dynamics of the Norse party were riddled with fissures that the pressure of the Skræling attacks widened into unbridgeable chasms. The Vinland expeditions were not state-backed enterprises like later European colonies. They were privately organized ventures, led by ambitious individuals whose goals often clashed. Freydis Eiriksdottir's later expedition, which ended with her murdering her Icelandic partners and their 5 women, reveals a level of internal violence and betrayal that would have destroyed any colony, regardless of external threats. The 6th paragraph of this opening chapter introduces the theme of internal discord, noting that the Norse and Vinland were as much a threat to each other as the Skrælings were. Karlsefni's decision to abandon the settlement was made against a backdrop of fraying morale, factional rivalries, and the grim realization that the Vinland dream was turning into a Vinland nightmare. The question, "Why didn't they stay?" thus has no single answer. It is a puzzle with many pieces, and over the next 14 chapters, we will assemble them one by one. The demographic math of the Vinland colony is the inescapable foundation upon which any explanation of its abandonment must be built. In the year 1000 AD, the total Norse population of Greenland, from which all Vinland colonists were drawn, numbered approximately 2,500 individuals, scattered across a few hundred farmsteads in the eastern and western settlements. This population was the product of just over a decade of colonization since Eric the Red's arrival in the 980s, and it was already stretched thin by the demands of carving out a living in a subarctic environment. Each farm needed all the labor it could muster to cut hay, tend livestock, hunt seals, and maintain the complex turf and stone buildings that protected against the bitter winters. Taking a large number of able-bodied adults out of this labor pool for a transatlantic colonization venture was not merely risky, it was a direct threat to the survival of the Greenland colony itself. The first paragraph of this chapter lays out the population constraints, using archaeological estimates of farm capacity and cemetery data to demonstrate that the Vinland venture was demographically a moonshot, a high-risk, high-reward gamble that only made sense if Vinland was both safe and enormously productive. The sagas tell us that Karlsefni's expedition, the largest and best equipped, consisted of 3 ships and 160 people, including women and children. To Greenland, this represented a loss of perhaps 6–8% of the total adult population, a staggering hemorrhage of human capital for a colony that was still in its infancy. If Vinland failed, those people would be lost to Greenland forever, either dead or settled elsewhere. This demographic math hung over every decision Karlsefni made. The composition of the Vinland population added further vulnerability. The expedition was not a military garrison of hardened warriors. It was a mixed community of families, including pregnant women like Gudrid, young children like her son Snorri, and the livestock that required constant care. While Norse women of the frontier were famously tough and capable, the presence of non-combatants drastically changed the strategic calculus. Every battle against the Skrælings risked not just the lives of the fighters but the entire reproductive future of the colony. A single unlucky Skræling arrow that killed a woman of childbearing age was a demographic wound that could never heal. The second paragraph of this chapter analyzes the demographic pyramid of the Vinland colony, comparing it to later successful colonies like Jamestown, which initially relied on a steady influx of single men and only later achieved demographic stability. The Norse had no such influx. They had to be demographically self-sustaining from day one, and the Skræling attacks made that virtually impossible. The sagas mention that Karlsefni's party spent 3 winters in Vinland is revealing. Even in that short time, the population would have suffered not only battle casualties but also deaths from disease, childbirth, and the harsh conditions of a new land. The birth of Snorri was a rare bright spot, but it could not offset the steady attrition. The mortality rate of transatlantic voyages in the Viking Age added another grim layer to the demographic challenge. Although the Norse Nars were seaworthy vessels that had successfully colonized Iceland and Greenland, the journey from Greenland to Vinland was no casual cruise. The Davis Strait was notorious for storms, icebergs, and sudden fogs, and the saga accounts mentioned ships being blown off course and spending extra weeks at sea. Each crossing carried a risk of shipwreck, and with every ship lost, the colony's lifeline grew thinner. The third paragraph of this chapter examines the maritime logistics of the Vinland supply chain, calculating that the round trip from the eastern settlement to Longhouses meadows and back could take anywhere from 6 weeks to several months, depending on weather and ice conditions. A colony that depended on annual resupply voyages was, in effect, holding its breath for months at a time, hoping that a single fragile wooden shell would make it across the stormiest stretch of ocean in the North Atlantic. The loss of even one supply ship would have been a catastrophe, leaving the colonists without new iron tools, without cloth, without the luxury goods that made life bearable, and without the reinforcements of new settlers. The Norse, who had no compass, no charts, and only celestial navigation to guide them, were pushing the limits of what was logistically possible for an 11th century society. The carrying capacity of the Vinland site itself, assessed through modern archaeological and ecological analysis, further constrained the colony's growth potential. The Longhouses meadows site, while well chosen, could support only a limited number of cattle and sheep on the available natural meadows. Overstocking would lead to overgrazing, soil erosion, and the collapse of the pasture base, a dynamic that the Norse, with their experience in Greenland's fragile environment, would have understood intuitively. The fourth paragraph of this chapter details the agricultural limitations, using soil science and paleobotanical data to estimate how many animal units the Vinland camp could sustain before environmental degradation set in. The conclusion is sobering. Even without Skræling attacks, the colony would have needed to expand rapidly into new areas, clearing forests and establishing satellite farms, which would have only intensified conflict with the native inhabitants. The Norse were caught in a classic frontier trap. They needed to grow to survive, but growth provoked the very resistance that made survival impossible. The absence of a large-scale, government-backed colonization program is a critical difference between the Vinland venture and later successful European colonies. The Vinland expeditions were financed by private individuals, chieftains like Karlsefni and Erik the Red's family, whose resources, while considerable by Icelandic standards, were laughably small compared to the royal treasuries that would fund Columbus, Cabot, and Cartier. The fifth paragraph of this chapter contrasts the Viking Age political economy with that of early modern Europe, emphasizing that the Norse world was a fragmented society of petty chieftaincies, where no single ruler had the authority or the resources to commit to a sustained transatlantic project. The King of Norway, who was busy consolidating his own realm and fighting the Danes, had no strategic interest in a distant, ice-bound colony, and the Greenlanders could not afford to finance a colony on their own. Without a steady stream of state-sponsored settlers and soldiers, Vinland was like a plant without water, doomed to wither. In sum, the demographic and logistical deck was stacked against Vinland from the beginning. The sixth paragraph of this chapter synthesizes these factors, arguing that the abandonment was not so much a choice as an inevitability, forced by the hard math of a tiny population trying to hold a vast, hostile land. The question, why didn't they stay, can be partially answered with a simple, brutal equation: the number of Norsemen who could be delivered to Vinland, divided by the number of Skrælings who were willing to fight to keep them out, yielded a quotient that spelled failure. The miracle, perhaps, is not that the Vikings left, but that they survived long enough to leave at all. The military superiority that the Norse are so famous for, the shining axes, the double-edged swords, the mail shirts glinting in the pale northern sun, proved, in the forests and along the beaches of Vinland, to be a brittle and ultimately useless advantage. The Viking way of war, honed over centuries of raiding the coasts of Europe, was based on speed, shock, and the terrifying cohesion of the shield wall. A Norse warband debarking from its longship on an unsuspecting village could overwhelm local resistance in minutes, seize portable wealth, and withdraw before any organized counterattack could be mounted. This model, however, presupposed a target that was stationary, wealthy, and poorly armed. None of these conditions obtained in Vinland. The Skrælings had no towns to sack, no churches to loot, no treasure hoards to seize. They were mobile hunter-gatherers whose wealth consisted of furs, bone tools, and the intangible riches of their environmental knowledge. More importantly, they fought back with a ferocity and tactical intelligence that the Norse, accustomed to being the technological alpha predators, were utterly unprepared for. The first paragraph of this chapter deconstructs the myth of Viking military invincibility, showing that the Norse combat system was optimized for a specific kind of warfare, short-duration raids against sedentary targets, and was poorly suited to the grinding, attritional counterinsurgency that Vinland demanded. The Skrælings, by refusing to offer a static target and by exploiting the broken terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks, negated the Norse heavy infantry advantage and turned the conflict into a contest of light infantry skirmishing, a contest they were exquisitely equipped to win. The weapons and tactics of the Skrælings deserve a detailed examination, for they reveal the nature of the military challenge the Norse faced. The primary Skræling weapon was the bow, a sophisticated composite or self-bow crafted from local wood and sinew, capable of launching stone-tipped arrows with lethal force at ranges of up to 30 meters or more. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that a flint-tipped arrow fired from a 50-pound draw-weight bow can penetrate the woolen tunics and even the budded mail that the less wealthy Norse warriors wore, and it can cause grievous wounds against unarmored limbs and faces. The Skrælings also employed the outladdle, a spear thrower that launched darts with terrifying velocity, and they may have used slings to hurl stones. The second paragraph of this chapter catalogues the Skræling arsenal, drawing on Dorset and Thule archaeological finds from sites like Port O'Shoy in Newfoundland and the Skræling Island sites in the high Arctic, to prove that the indigenous weaponry was not a primitive joke but a mature, lethal technology perfectly adapted to the environment. The stone points were sharper than many steel blades, and the wounds they inflicted were ragged, prone to infection, and often fatal even if not immediately so. Thorfinn Eriksson, struck by an arrow under the arm, died not because he was a coward but because even the best Viking armor had gaps, and the Skræling archers were skilled enough to find them. The Skræling battle tactics, as deduced from the saga narratives and from ethnographic analogy with later Inuit and Native American warfare, were those of highly mobile light infantry. They attacked from the sea in flotillas of swift, silent skin boats, kayaks and umiaks, that could appear out of the fog, land on any beach, and retreat in minutes. They used terrain for cover, creeping through the alder thickets and behind the rocky outcrops that fringed the Norse camp. Their use of the bullroarer, that whirring, moaning instrument, was a form of psychological warfare designed to disorient and terrify the enemy before the arrows began to fly. The third paragraph of this chapter reconstructs a Skræling assault from the perspective of a Norse defender, using the saga descriptions of the countless skin boats and the hail of missiles, like drifting snow, to paint a vivid picture of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of an indigenous counterattack. The Norse, who were trained to stand shoulder to shoulder and face the enemy directly, found themselves fighting a ghost, an enemy who refused to close, who struck from a distance, and who vanished into the landscape as quickly as he had appeared. The leadership and morale of the Norse forces were critical factors in their defeat. Karlsefni, the merchant-turned-colonial governor, was not a battle-hardened Viking warlord. He was a man of commerce and calculation, and his tactical decisions during the Skræling attacks reflect a cautious, defensive mindset that may have been prudent but did little to inspire his men. The saga's description of the Norse warriors fleeing in panic, only to be shamed and rallied by the pregnant Freydis, is a damning indictment of their battle readiness. The fourth paragraph of this chapter analyzes the psychology of the Norse retreat, arguing that the men were experiencing a form of combat stress that was entirely new to them. In their European raids, they had been the aggressors, the ones who struck terror. In Vinland, the roles were reversed. They were the small, isolated band, surrounded by a hostile population, living in constant fear of the next attack. This psychological burden, combined with the unfamiliarity of the Skræling fighting style, eroded their courage and made them unreliable in battle. The fact that they were saved not by their own swords but by Freydis' desperate, almost suicidal act of defiance underscores the depth of their demoralization. The strategic impossibility of winning a protracted war against the Skrælings was a lesson that Karlsefni absorbed quickly. Even if the Norse won every skirmish, even if they killed 10 Skrælings for every Norseman lost, the arithmetic was against them. The Skræling population of the region, while not enormous, was orders of magnitude larger than the Norse settlement, and could absorb losses that the Norse could not. The fifth paragraph of this chapter lays out this strategic calculus in cold, numerical terms. A single Norse casualty represented a permanent reduction of perhaps 1% of the total combat-capable manpower. A single Skræling casualty was a negligible fraction of the regional population. The Norse could not win a war of attrition, and the Skrælings, by their persistent attacks, made it clear that they were willing to fight a war of exactly that type. Karlsefni, faced with this logic, made the only rational choice. He cut his losses and withdrew. The military history of Vinland, then, is not a story of cowardice or incompetence but of a rational response to an unwinnable war. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes that the abandonment was, in large part, a military retreat, a recognition that the Skrælings had achieved a strategic victory that no amount of tactical heroics could overturn. The Vikings, who had terrorized the continent, met their match in a people who understood their own land, who fought with skill and determination, and who refused to be intimidated by shining metal or bearded faces. The arrow that killed Thorvald was not just a weapon, it was a message, and the Norse eventually understood it. The economic dimension of the Vinland venture, often overshadowed by the dramatic battles and colorful personalities, is arguably the most critical factor in explaining the abandonment. The Norse who sailed to Vinland were not simply adventurers seeking glory. They were investors, farmers, and traders who expected the colony to generate a return that justified the immense risk and cost. The Vinland project, from an economic perspective, was a startup venture, a speculative enterprise that required an initial outlay of capital, ships, tools, livestock, provisions, in the hope of future profits from timber, furs, and possibly a new agricultural base. The first paragraph of this chapter frames the Vinland expeditions in economic terms, analyzing the cost of outfitting a single nar for a transatlantic voyage, including the value of the ship itself, the wages or shares of the crew, and the opportunity cost of removing labor from the Greenland farms. By the standards of the 11th century North Atlantic, Karlsefni's 3-ship expedition represented a colossal investment, likely the life savings of several prominent families. The pressure to generate a positive return was immense, and the ongoing cost of maintaining the colony in the face of Skrælings attacks quickly turned the venture into a financial sinkhole. The revenue streams that the Norse hoped to tap in Vinland were threefold: timber, furs, and farmland. Timber was the most immediate and valuable resource. Greenland, as noted, was virtually treeless, and the ability to ship straight pine and spruce back to the eastern settlement for building boats and houses was worth its weight in silver. The sagas mention that the returning ships were loaded with timber and other goods, and this cargo alone may have made the voyages marginally profitable. The second paragraph of this chapter evaluates the timber trade, using data on timber volumes in Norse cargo ships and the known demand in Greenland to estimate the potential profit from a single Vinland shipment. While the timber could certainly fetch a high price, the cost of transporting it across 1,500 kilometers of open ocean, with the risk of shipwreck, eroded the margins significantly. The fur trade, with the Skrælings providing bundles of high-quality marten and beaver pelts in exchange for red cloth, was another potential revenue source, but it was entirely dependent on peaceful relations. Once the fighting started, the fur trade evaporated, and the Norse were left with only what they could hunt or gather themselves. The agricultural potential of Vinland, which had so excited the first explorers, proved to be a mirage when examined through the lens of economic reality. The wild grapes that gave Vinland its name were likely the riverbank grape or the northern wild raisin, not the wine-producing Vitis vinifera of Europe. While they could be eaten or made into a crude wine, they were not a high-value trade commodity. The self-sown wheat mentioned by the sagas was probably lime grass or wild rye, edible but not competitive with the grain that could be grown in Europe or even imported to Greenland. The third paragraph of this chapter deflates the agricultural bubble, showing that Vinland was not the agricultural paradise that the early reports suggested. The growing season, while longer than Greenland's, was still short by European standards, and the soils of coastal Newfoundland were thin and acidic. To make Vinland agriculturally profitable, the Norse would have needed to clear vast tracts of forest, drain wetlands, and invest years of labor into building up soil fertility, an investment that was impossible to protect while under constant Skræling attack. The cost of the military defense, which the sagas only hint at, must have been enormous in terms of diverted labor and resources. Every hour a Norseman spent standing guard with a spear was an hour he was not cutting timber, fishing, or tending livestock. The construction of the barricade, the repair of weapons, the treatment of wounds, all of these consumed the colony's limited resources without generating any revenue. The fourth paragraph of this chapter attempts to quantify the economic burden of defense, comparing it to modern estimates of the security premium that businesses in conflict zones must pay. The Vinland colony was effectively operating under siege conditions, and the siege imposed a tax on productivity that made profitable operation impossible. The Norse, pragmatic merchants that they were, could read a balance sheet as well as a rune stone, and the balance sheet of Vinland was bleeding red ink. The alternative to a permanent, self-sustaining colony was a seasonal extraction model, whereby the Norse would sail to Vinland in the summer, harvest timber and furs, and return to Greenland before winter. This model, which was actually adopted after the final abandonment, would have avoided the cost of maintaining a permanent settlement and minimized conflict with the Skrælings by reducing the Norse footprint. The fifth paragraph of this chapter discusses the evidence for seasonal voyages to Markland, the forested Labrador coast, for timber gathering, which continued for centuries after Vinland was abandoned. The Norse, in other words, did not abandon North America entirely. They simply abandoned the attempt to live there permanently. They adjusted their economic model from colonization to extraction, a shift that preserved access to the resources they needed while eliminating the deadly overhead of a full settlement. In the final analysis, the abandonment of Vinland was a rational economic decision, made by hard-headed merchants who realized that the costs of colonization outweighed the benefits. The sixth paragraph of this chapter synthesizes the economic argument, concluding that Vinland was a bad investment, a venture capital project that failed to deliver a competitive return and that was mercifully liquidated before it could drag the entire Greenland economy down with it. The Vikings, for all their martial prowess, were fundamentally practical people, and they knew when to cut their losses. Porque eles não ficaram? Because it simply didn't pay. The leadership of Thorfinn Karlsefni is at the very heart of the abandonment decision, and to understand why the Vikings left, we must understand the man who made the final call. Karlsefni, whose full name was Thorfinn Thordarson, was born into a wealthy Icelandic merchant family around 980 AD and had built a reputation as a shrewd and successful trader before ever setting foot in Greenland. His marriage to Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, a woman of remarkable spiritual authority and personal courage, linked him to the powerful Erik the Red clan and gave him access to the accumulated knowledge of the Vinland voyages. Unlike many Viking Age leaders, who were driven by a hunger for fame and glory in battle, Karlsefni appears to have been motivated primarily by the prospect of wealth and the establishment of a prosperous estate for his family. The first paragraph of this chapter paints a portrait of Karlsefni as a proto-capitalist explorer, a man who evaluated Vinland not as a stage for heroic deeds but as a business proposition. His decisions during the Vinland venture, the careful organization of the expedition, the strict ban on trading weapons to the Skrælings, and ultimately the order to withdraw, all reflect a calculating mind that prioritized long-term viability over short-term glory. Karlsefni's leadership style during the Skræling crisis reveals both his strengths and his limitations. On the one hand, his refusal to trade iron weapons to the Skrælings demonstrated strategic foresight. He understood that arming a potential enemy with metal that could be turned into arrowheads and knife blades would be suicidal. On the other hand, his tactical leadership during the actual battle was indecisive, and the saga's account of the Norse flight suggests that he was unable to maintain discipline and cohesion under the stress of an unfamiliar form of combat. The second paragraph of this chapter analyzes Karlsefni's command decisions in detail, using the saga text as a primary source and comparing his actions with what is known of Norse military doctrine. The picture that emerges is of a competent manager, but not a charismatic warrior hero of the old school. He was the right man to organize a trading voyage, but perhaps the wrong man to lead a frontier settlement through a war of survival. The fact that the colony was saved not by his battle plan but by Freydis' unauthorized act of defiance is a telling comment on his command presence. The decision to abandon Vinland, which Karlsefni presented to his council as a fait accompli, was the product of a rigorous, if unspoken, cost-benefit analysis. The sagas tell us that he argued that the land was good, but that they could not live in peace, and that the constant fear of attack would make life unbearable. What the sagas do not explicitly say, but what is implied in every line, is that Karlsefni was also thinking about the value of his ships, the safety of his wife and infant son, and the future of his political and economic standing in Iceland. The third paragraph of this chapter explores the personal stakes for Karlsefni, noting that a failed colony would not only have cost him his fortune but also his reputation, which in medieval Icelandic society was a form of capital every bit as real as silver. By returning to Greenland with a cargo of valuable timber and exotic goods, and by bringing his family home safely, Karlsefni was able to salvage a partial return on his investment and to frame the Vinland venture as a successful exploration, even if the colonization attempt had failed. The sagas, written by his descendants, certainly present him in a positive light, suggesting that he managed the narrative as skillfully as he managed his ships. The role of the other leaders in the Vinland venture, particularly Freydis Eiriksdottir, must be considered alongside Karlsefni's decisions. Freydis's later expedition, which ended in the murder of the Icelandic brothers Helgi and Finnbogi and their followers, exposed the dark underbelly of the Vinland project and demonstrated that internal violence could be even more destructive than Skrælings arrows. The fourth paragraph of this chapter examines the impact of the Freydis atrocity on the broader Norse perception of Vinland. When Leif Erikson learned of the murders, he declared Freydis and her descendants accursed, but the damage to Vinland's reputation was already done. The failed colony was now associated not just with foreign danger but with domestic treachery, a combination that made any future colonization efforts politically and socially toxic. Karlsefni, who had managed his own expedition without such atrocities, must have looked at Freydis's debacle and felt vindicated in his decision to get out while he could. The post-Vinland career of Karlsefni is instructive. He settled back in Iceland, purchasing a large estate called Glomber in the Skagafjord Valley, and lived out his days as a respected chieftain. His son Snorri, born in Vinland, grew up to become an important figure, and from his lineage descended bishops and notable Icelanders. The fifth paragraph of this chapter traces the trajectory of Karlsefni's family, showing how the Vinland adventure, despite its failure as a colonial project, was successfully converted into social and genealogical capital. Karlsefni died a wealthy and honored man, a testament to his ability to make a smart retreat. The lesson he took from Vinland, that transatlantic colonization was a fool's errand given the resources of the time, was one that the Norse community internalized for the next 500 years. In the final assessment, Karlsefni emerges as a pragmatist who made the right call for the wrong romantic reasons that later historians might have preferred. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes that the abandonment of Vinland was, in many ways, Karlsefni's finest moment, a recognition of reality over fantasy, a decision that saved lives and preserved wealth. He did not have the ships, the men, or the iron to win a war against the continent, and he had the wisdom to acknowledge that before it was too late. The Vikings left because their leader was smart enough to know when to stop. The political economy of the Viking Age provides a macro-level framework for understanding why a transatlantic colony was an idea whose time had not yet come. The Norse world of the 11th century was a fragmented landscape of petty kingdoms, independent chieftaincies, and loosely organized commonwealths like the Icelandic Althing. There was no centralized state with the fiscal capacity to finance long-distance colonization, no royal navy to protect transatlantic sea lanes, and no mercantile corporation with the capital reserves to absorb the losses of a failed venture. The Vinland expeditions were privately financed, relying on the wealth of individual chieftains and the labor of free farmers who could choose to walk away at any time. The first paragraph of this chapter situates the Vinland colony within the broader context of the Viking Age political economy, contrasting it with the state-backed explorations of the early modern period. The Norse were still operating on a gift and plunder economic model, supplemented by trade, but they lacked the sophisticated financial instruments, joint stock companies, marine insurance, colonial charters, that would later underwrite the European conquest of the Americas. The Greenland colony itself, which was the staging ground for Vinland, was a precarious venture that never achieved economic self-sufficiency. As noted, the Greenlanders relied on exports of walrus ivory, narwhal tusks, and furs to pay for the iron, timber, and grain they needed from Europe. This dependency created a structural vulnerability. Any disruption in the European market, any pirate raid on the trade route, any climatic shift that closed the sea ice could tip the Greenland economy into crisis. The second paragraph of this chapter analyzes the Greenland economy in detail, using trade records and archaeological evidence to show that the Greenlanders were living on a knife edge. The diversion of scarce resources, ships, men, iron, to the Vinland venture must have been a source of anxiety for the Greenland chieftains who stayed home. When Vinland failed, the resources that had been sunk into it were lost, and the Greenland colony, which had gambled on a Western bonanza, was left weaker than before. The economics of raiding versus trading, a classic theme in Viking studies, also played a role in the Vinland decision. The Vikings are famous for their raids on the rich monasteries and towns of Europe, but the Vinland expeditions were not raids, they were settlement attempts. The Skrælings, as a mobile and materially poor society, offered nothing worth raiding. There were no gold altars, no silver chalices, no sacks of coin to be seized and carried back to the ships. The third paragraph of this chapter explores this point, arguing that the Viking economic toolbox was poorly suited to the New World environment. The Norse were experts at extracting wealth from settled, agrarian societies through violence and intimidation. When they encountered a society that could not be profitably raided and could not be easily traded with, their economic model broke down. Vinland forced the Norse into the role of subsistence farmers, a role they had not sought and did not relish, and the return on that investment was simply too low. The comparative advantage that the Skrælings held in their own environment was a crucial economic factor. The Norse could not compete with the Skrælings in the fur trade, because the Skrælings were the better hunters and trappers. They could not compete in the marine resource extraction, because the Skrælings had more efficient boats and hunting techniques for the local seals and fish. The fourth paragraph of this chapter applies the economic concept of comparative advantage to the Vinland situation, showing that the Norse had no economic niche in Vinland that the Skrælings could not fill better and cheaper. The only unique Norse product was iron, but the Norse were understandably reluctant to trade away their one technological edge, and even if they had, the iron trade would have eventually saturated the limited Skræling market. Vinland, in economic terms, had no reason to exist as a Norse colony. It was a solution in search of a problem. The transition to a seasonal extraction model, which we have already mentioned, was the rational economic response to the failure of the permanent colony. The fifth paragraph of this chapter examines the evidence for later Norse voyages to Markland, documented in Icelandic annals from the 14th century, which describe ships going to collect timber. These voyages were low cost, low risk, and generated a steady, if modest, supply of a vital resource without the enormous overhead of a permanent settlement. The Norse, in effect, learned from their Vinland failure and developed a more sustainable, if less glamorous, model of transatlantic resource extraction. The Vinland colony had been an attempt to hit a home run. The Markland voyages were a series of steady base hits, and they served the Greenlanders well for centuries. The final economic lesson of Vinland is that colonialism is expensive, and the Vikings of the 11th century simply could not afford it. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the economic argument, stating that the abandonment was not a failure of courage, but a triumph of cost accounting. The Norse had the ships to reach America, but they did not have the financial system to support a permanent colony. That financial system would not develop in Europe for another 400 years, and when it did, it would be the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, and the French who reaped the benefits. The Vikings were pioneers, but they were pioneers with empty pockets, and Vinland was a mansion they could not afford to maintain. The cultural and psychological factors behind the Vinland abandonment are less quantifiable than the military or economic ones, but they are no less real. The Norse who came to Vinland brought with them a deeply ingrained set of cultural expectations about how a colony should function, what a landscape should look like, and how social relations should be organized. When these expectations collided with the reality of the North American wilderness and its inhabitants, the resulting cognitive dissonance was deeply destabilizing. The Norse were a people of the hall and the farmstead, of fixed settlements, inherited land, and a social hierarchy anchored in the ownership of livestock. The first paragraph of this chapter explores the Norse cultural blueprint for colonization, as seen in the settlement of Iceland and Greenland. In those earlier frontiers, the Norse had faced empty landscapes that they could shape to their liking, imposing their familiar patterns of field and pasture. Vinland, however, was not empty. It was already shaped by the Skrælings, and it resisted the Norse cultural imprint. This resistance, more subtle than an arrow in the chest but equally powerful, eroded the colonists' sense of being in control of their environment and their destiny. The psychological impact of being a tiny minority in a vast, unknown land cannot be overstated. The Norse were accustomed to being the dominant culture in their spheres of operation. Even in their raids on Europe, they were the aggressors, the ones who dictated the terms of engagement. In Vinland, the roles were reversed. The Norse were the small, vulnerable band, huddled behind a makeshift barricade, listening to the eerie whirring of the Skrælings bull roars in the fog. The second paragraph of this chapter delves into the psychology of the colonial experience, drawing on modern studies of combat stress and the experiences of later frontier settlers to reconstruct the mental state of a Vinland Norseman. The constant hypervigilance, the inability to distinguish a rustling bush from an approaching warrior, the gnawing fear that the next dawn would bring a flotilla of skin boats. This was a recipe for chronic anxiety and eventual breakdown. The sagas note that the Norse were in great fear, is a masterful understatement of a population experiencing collective trauma. The role of women in the Vinland colony adds another layer to the psychological dynamic. The presence of wives, mothers, and children meant that the colony was not just a military outpost but a nascent community, with all the emotional attachments and vulnerabilities that entails. Gudrid's pregnancy and the birth of Snorri were moments of hope, but they also underscored the stakes. If the colony failed, it was not just a commercial loss, it was a threat to the lives of the most vulnerable. The third paragraph of this chapter analyzes the gender dynamics of the Vinland settlement, noting that the saga authors, writing from a 13th century Christian perspective, placed considerable emphasis on the female characters precisely because they represented the domestic, peaceful future that Vinland was supposed to have. The failure of that future, symbolized by Freydis' transformation from protector to murderer, was a profound cultural wound. The Norse concept of luck and fate, deeply rooted in pre-Christian beliefs that still influenced the 11th century mindset, also played a role in the decision to leave. The Norse believed that certain individuals and places possessed intrinsic luck or unluck, a quality that could be perceived through a series of signs and omens. Thorvald's death, the terrifying bull roar sound, the flight of the men, and even the accidental milk poisoning, all of these would have been interpreted as signs that Vinland was an unlucky place, a place where the ancestors and the gods, or the new Christian god, had withdrawn their favor. The fourth paragraph of this chapter explores the concept of luck in Norse culture, using saga episodes and Eddic poetry to explain why the accumulation of negative signs would have been a legitimate and powerful reason for abandonment. Karlsefni, whatever his economic calculus, could also have believed that Vinland was simply not meant to be. The inability of the Norse to understand or respect Skræling culture closed off the possibility of the kind of diplomatic accommodation that later European colonies sometimes achieved with native peoples. The Norse had no framework for negotiating with a people they considered barely human. The saga term, Skræling, itself, possibly derived from a word meaning wretch or screamer, indicates a deep-seated contempt that made genuine communication impossible. The fifth paragraph of this chapter examines the linguistic and cultural barriers, arguing that the Norse failure to engage diplomatically was not a tactical error but a structural feature of their worldview. They did not see the Skrælings as a nation with whom treaties could be made. They saw them as a pestilence to be exterminated or endured. When extermination failed, and endurance proved too costly, the only remaining option was departure. The psychological relief of returning to the known world, to the familiar fjords of Greenland and Iceland, to the sound of the Latin Mass, to the company of kin and the security of an established social order, must have been immense. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the cultural analysis by suggesting that the abandonment of Vinland was, in a sense, a homecoming, a return to a world that made sense. The Vikings left because Vinland was not just dangerous, it was alien, a place where the old rules did not apply and where the Norse sense of self was constantly under assault. They chose cultural continuity over the promise of a new world, and in doing so, they preserved their identity even as they surrendered their American foothold. The role of the Skrælings in the Vinland abandonment cannot be overstated, but it must be understood in all its complexity. The Skrælings were not a monolithic enemy, they were a diverse population of indigenous peoples, likely including Dorset Palea Eskimos, the ancestors of the Beothuk, and possibly early Algonquian speakers, who had inhabited the northeastern coasts of North America for millennia. Their victory over the Norse was not a lucky accident but the result of a deeply sophisticated, adaptive response to an alien incursion. The first paragraph of this chapter introduces the Skrælings as the primary agents of the Norse departure, arguing that without their active, organized resistance, Vinland might well have become a permanent Norse colony. The saga accounts, for all their bias, make it clear that the Skrælings were the proximate cause of the decision to leave. It was their arrows, their numbers, and their terrifying war cries that broke the Norse will to stay. The Skrælings, in short, were the gatekeepers of North America, and they refused to open the gate. The intelligence and adaptability displayed by the Skrælings in their dealings with the Norse reveal a people who were quick to learn and slow to trust. The initial peaceful trade, in which the Skrælings eagerly exchanged valuable furs for strips of red cloth, suggests a willingness to engage with the newcomers on mutually beneficial terms. However, the rapid deterioration of relations following the bull incident and the alleged milk poisoning indicates that the Skrælings were also capable of rapidly reassessing a situation and shifting to a hostile posture when they perceived a threat. The second paragraph of this chapter analyzes the Skræling decision-making process, using models of indigenous contact from anthropology to suggest that the Skrælings likely held a council, evaluated the Norse presence, and reached a collective decision to expel the intruders. The coordinated nature of the Skræling attacks, the massed flotillas of skin boats, the synchronized use of psychological warfare, argues strongly for a centralized or at least widely shared strategic objective. The military technology of the Skrælings, which we have already examined in detail, was a necessary condition for their victory, but it was not sufficient. The third paragraph of this chapter focuses on the Skræling strategy of attrition, noting that the indigenous fighters did not need to win a decisive battle. They simply needed to make the Norse position untenable over time. Each Skræling raid, even if repulsed, inflicted casualties and consumed resources. Each winter the Norse spent in Vinland was a winter of fear and privation, while the Skrælings retreated to their familiar hunting grounds, secure in their ability to outlast the invaders. The Norse, who had expected a quick and profitable settlement, were instead caught in a quagmire that drained their morale and their manpower. The Skrælings understood, perhaps instinctively, that time was on their side, and they used it ruthlessly. The two Skræling boys captured by Karlsefni represent a tragic but important source of intelligence for the Norse, and their testimony may have played a role in the abandonment decision. The saga records that the boys were taught to speak Norse and that they reported that the Skrælings had a king and that their country was vast and populous. The fourth paragraph of this chapter evaluates the credibility of this intelligence, noting that it was filtered through a language barrier and the trauma of captivity, but also that it likely conveyed a genuine warning. The Skrælings were not a small, scattered band that could be easily overcome. They were a numerous people with a form of political organization capable of mobilizing large war parties. This information, combined with the first-hand experience of battle, would have confirmed Karlsefni's worst fears and reinforced the logic of withdrawal. The Skræling boys, in their enforced role as informants, may have inadvertently saved their people from a larger, later invasion by making the case for Vinland's impregnability. The long-term consequences of the Skræling victory for the indigenous peoples of the Northeast were immense. By driving the Norse out, the Skrælings ensured that the Americas would remain isolated from the disease pool of the Old World for another 5 centuries. The fifth paragraph of this chapter speculates on what might have happened had the Norse succeeded. A permanent Norse colony in Vinland would likely have served as a bridgehead for the introduction of Old World pathogens, smallpox, measles, influenza, centuries before the Columbian exchange. The indigenous populations, lacking immunity, would have suffered the same catastrophic die-offs that later occurred, but 400 years earlier, and with no subsequent wave of European colonization to take advantage. The result might have been a partially depopulated but not colonized Americas, a scenario with unfathomable consequences. The Skræling arrows, by holding the line, inadvertently preserved the demographic integrity of the Americas for half a millennium. The legacy of the Skræling resistance is a story of indigenous agency that deserves to be celebrated alongside the more familiar tales of European exploration. The sixth and final paragraph of this chapter concludes that the Skrælings were the true victors of Vinland, the ones who dictated the terms of the encounter and who ultimately closed the door on the Norse expansion. The question of why the Vikings left cannot be answered without centering the Skrælings as the decisive factor. They were the ones who made the cost of staying too high, and their victory, though almost forgotten, is one of the most significant indigenous triumphs in the history of the Americas. The logistical impossibility of sustaining a transatlantic colony with 11th century technology is a central pillar of the abandonment thesis, and it deserves a dedicated examination of the ships, the navigation, and the supply chain that linked Vinland to Greenland. The vessels used for the Vinland voyages were Nars, the cargo ships of the Viking Age, which were broader, deeper, and slower than the famous longships. A typical Nar was around 16 meters long, 4.5 meters wide, and could carry a cargo of up to 20 to 30 tons, with a crew of 6 to 12 men. The open deck offered no shelter from the weather, and a single square sail was efficient only with a following wind. The first paragraph of this chapter reconstructs the physical reality of a Vinland voyage, from the loading of the ship with livestock, tools, and provisions at Brattle in Greenland, to the weeks of open ocean sailing across the Davis Strait, with the constant danger of icebergs, sudden gales, and the damp cold that seeped into every bone. The journey was not a pleasure cruise. It was a brutal, dangerous ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance and ship construction. The supply requirements of a permanent colony were far greater than those of a seasonal exploration camp. To sustain 160 people for a year, Karlsefni would have needed to transport or produce on site a staggering quantity of food, clothing, tools, and weapons. The second paragraph of this chapter calculates the annual caloric needs of the Vinland colony, based on modern nutritional estimates for active adults in cold climates, and translates those calories into the required quantities of grain, dairy, meat, and fish. Even with the abundant local resources of salmon and game, the Norse could not afford to let their livestock starve, because the animals were their long-term food security and their source of dairy products. The hay to feed the cattle through the winter had to be cut and dried during the brief summer, a labor-intensive task that competed directly with the time needed for defense, exploration, and ship repair. The logistical equation was brutally simple. The Norse could either feed themselves or defend themselves, but they could not do both at a level that would sustain the colony indefinitely. The transportation of iron, the most critical strategic material, was a particularly acute bottleneck. The Vinland colony had a small smithy where local bog iron was smelted, but the output was tiny and could not replace the iron tools and weapons brought from Greenland. Every broken axe, every lost spearhead, was a permanent reduction in the colony's capital equipment unless a resupply ship arrived with replacements. The third paragraph of this chapter analyzes the iron supply chain, using metallurgical analysis of Norse artifacts to show how heavily the colony depended on imported metal. The Skrælings, who manufactured their tools from locally abundant stone, bone, and antler, had no such dependency. Their supply chain was entirely local and infinitely renewable. The Norse iron dependency was a logistical Achilles heel that the Skrælings, by their persistent attacks, were able to exploit. The navigation challenges of the North Atlantic route added a further layer of uncertainty and risk. The Norse had no magnetic compass, no accurate maps, and no way to measure longitude. They navigated by the sun, the stars, the color of the water, the presence of seabirds, and the accumulated experience of their ship's captains. The fourth paragraph of this chapter describes the Viking navigation techniques in detail, including the possible use of sun compasses and the legendary sunstones that could locate the sun on cloudy days. These techniques were adequate for making landfall and following a coast, but they were not precise enough to guarantee a fast, reliable crossing. A ship could be delayed for weeks by contrary winds, and every day of delay was a day that the Vinland colony went without the supplies it desperately needed. The psychological burden of this uncertainty, the feeling of being cut off from the world and dependent on a ship that might never come, weighed heavily on the settlers. The final logistical failure was the inability to establish a reliable system of communication and reinforcement between Vinland and Greenland. The sagas mention that after Karlsefni's expedition, no large-scale settlement was attempted, but they do not record the specific reasons for this cessation. The fifth paragraph of this chapter argues that the cumulative logistical burden, the loss of ships, the death of experienced sailors, the consumption of scarce Greenland resources, simply made the Vinland venture unsustainable. The Greenlanders, faced with the choice between investing in their own precarious survival and pouring resources into a distant, embattled outpost, chose the former. The Vinland colony was a secondary priority that could not be maintained when the primary priority, the survival of Greenland, was itself in doubt. In the final analysis, the logistical constraints of the Viking Age were an insuperable barrier to permanent transatlantic colonization. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes that the Vikings left Vinland not because they lacked the will, but because they lacked the way. The technology of the 11th century could get them to America, but it could not keep them there. The abandonment was an acknowledgement of this logistical reality, a recognition that the Atlantic was not a highway but a wall, and that the wall could not be breached with the resources at hand. The environmental challenges of Vinland, while often overshadowed by the human conflict, were a constant, grinding pressure that wore down the Norse colony's resilience. The climate of Newfoundland around 1000 AD, during the medieval warm period, was milder than today, but it was still a subarctic maritime environment with short, cool summers, long, harsh winters, and a persistent dampness that rotted wood, rusted iron, and chilled the bones. The Norse, coming from Greenland and Iceland, were no strangers to cold, but the specific challenges of Vinland, the dense fog banks, the sudden storms, the freeze-thaw cycles that cracked their turf walls, were different enough to cause constant maintenance problems. The first paragraph of this chapter reconstructs the climate of Vinland using paleoclimatic data from ice cores and sediment records, showing that while the land was warmer than Greenland, it was still a marginal environment for European-style agriculture. The growing season, perhaps 120 to 140 days, was sufficient for hardy barley but not for the wheat that the sagas, self-sown wheat, led them to hope for. The Norse agricultural package was a delicate machine that had been fine-tuned for the subarctic, but Vinland pushed its limits. The wildlife of Vinland presented both opportunities and threats. The salmon runs were indeed abundant, providing a seasonal bonanza of protein, and the caribou herds offered meat and hides. But the Norse also encountered predators, wolves, bears, that threatened their livestock, and the unfamiliarity of the ecosystem meant that the settlers did not always know which plants were edible, which were poisonous, and which could be used for medicine. The second paragraph of this chapter examines the Norse interaction with the Vinland ecosystem, using the butternut evidence to show that they explored widely in search of familiar resources, but also arguing that their ecological knowledge was thin and poorly adapted to the New World. The Skrælings, by contrast, had an encyclopedic understanding of every plant, animal, and seasonal cycle, an understanding that gave them a decisive advantage in utilizing the landscape. The Norse were ecological amateurs in a place where the Skrælings were ecological masters. The deforestation required to build and maintain the Norse settlement had environmental consequences that the settlers themselves may not have fully anticipated. Cutting down the spruce and birch forest to build houses, to clear pasture, and to fuel the smithy's charcoal fire altered the local microclimate, increased soil erosion, and reduced the habitat for the very game animals the Norse hunted. The third paragraph of this chapter uses modern forestry and ecological data to model the impact of the Norse land clearance, suggesting that within a few years, the local environment around longhouses meadows would have been visibly degraded, with stumps, muddy paths, and overgrazed meadows replacing the pristine woodland that the Skrælings had carefully managed with fire and selective hunting. This degradation would have been a visual and practical reproach to the Norse, a sign that their way of life was not sustainable in this new land. The availability of fresh water was another environmental factor that is often overlooked. The Norse camp at longhouses meadows was situated near a small stream, but the quality and quantity of that water would have varied with the seasons, and the concentration of humans and livestock in one place would have quickly led to fecal contamination. The fourth paragraph of this chapter discusses the sanitation challenges of a medieval settlement, noting that the Norse had no concept of germ theory and no infrastructure for waste disposal beyond tossing refuse into the midden heap. Dysentery, parasitic infections, and other waterborne diseases would have been a constant threat, especially to the young and the old, adding a hidden layer of mortality to the colony's burden. The Skræling understanding of environmental management, which included the use of fire to create and maintain productive hunting grounds, was a form of ecological engineering that the Norse failed to recognize or appreciate. The Skrælings had been shaping the Vinland landscape for centuries, creating a mosaic of forest, meadow, and berry patch that maximized biodiversity and supported a stable human population. The fifth paragraph of this chapter explores this indigenous environmental management, using palynological studies that show evidence of pre-Norse burning and plant cultivation, to argue that Vinland was not a wilderness, but a carefully tended garden. The Norse, by attempting to impose their own agricultural logic on this managed landscape, were not just fighting the Skrælings, they were fighting the very land itself. The environmental mismatch between the Norse colonial model and the Vinland ecology was, in the end, yet another reason why the colony could not endure. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes that the Vikings left because Vinland, for all its initial promise, turned out to be an ecological trap, a place that looked like a green paradise to a sailor's eye but which, on closer acquaintance, resisted every attempt to make it into a European home. The internal politics and social dynamics of the Vinland colony were a microcosm of the larger Norse world, complete with the factionalism, honor feuds, and personal ambitions that had driven the settlement of Iceland and Greenland. The Vinland expeditions were not a unified national project. They were a series of privately organized ventures, each led by a chieftain who expected to reap the rewards of success and who would bear the shame of failure. This competitive, individualistic ethos had served the Norse well in the conquest of empty islands, where a leader could simply claim a fjord and parcel out land to his followers. In Vinland, however, the presence of a hostile indigenous population and the extreme logistical pressure demanded unity and cooperation, qualities that the Norse leadership failed to provide. The first paragraph of this chapter analyzes the leadership structure of the Vinland colony, highlighting the tension between Karlsefni, the wealthy merchant, and Freydis, the illegitimate daughter of Eric the Red, with her fierce ambition and her willingness to use violence against her own people. The colony was never a cohesive community. It was a fragile coalition of egos and interests that cracked under pressure. The saga accounts of the internal conflicts are revealing. The Freydis expedition, which we have discussed in earlier chapters, is the most dramatic example of internal violence, but it was not an isolated incident. The sagas mention disputes over housing, over the division of labor, and over the trading of weapons, all of which created a simmering resentment that sapped the colony's morale. The second paragraph of this chapter delves into these micro-conflicts, using the saga text to reconstruct the day-to-day tensions of life in a small, isolated settlement where personalities clashed and where the usual outlets for social tension, the Thing assembly, the support of extended kin, were absent. The Vinland colonists were trapped together, and they were getting on each other's nerves, a situation that was fertile ground for the kind of paranoid accusations that Freydis used to justify her massacre. The role of women in the Vinland power dynamics is particularly fascinating. Freydis, Gudrid, and the unnamed women of the colony were not passive figures. They were active agents with their own agendas and their own sources of influence. Gudrid's spiritual authority, demonstrated in the saga by her vision during the Skræling attack, gave her a moral standing that complemented Karlsefni's economic power. Freydis's capacity for violence, which she wielded both against the Skrælings and against her fellow Norse, made her a figure of fear and respect. The third paragraph of this chapter examines the gender politics of Vinland, arguing that the unusual prominence of women in the saga narratives reflects the exceptional nature of the Vinland environment, where traditional gender roles were stretched and where women's actions could tip the balance of events. The presence of powerful women may have been a source of both strength and tension, as male leaders like Karlsefni navigated the challenges of sharing authority with formidable female figures. The death of Thorfinn Eriksson, the brother of Leif, at the hands of the Skrælings created a void in the leadership structure that was never properly filled. Thorvald was the designated heir to the Vinland project, the one who was supposed to carry forward the family's claim. His death left a power vacuum that Karlsefni, as an outsider married into the family, could not fully occupy. The fourth paragraph of this chapter analyzes the succession crisis, noting that in the Norse honor culture, a slain leader's kin were obligated to seek revenge, a dynamic that could drive cycles of violence that were impossible to stop. The Skræling arrow that killed Thorvald did more than slay a man. It shattered the chain of legitimate command and set the stage for the factional struggles that would follow. The decision-making process that led to the final abandonment was not a single, clear-headed act of statesmanship but a messy, contested negotiation among the surviving leaders. The sagas tell us that Karlsefni called a council and laid out his arguments, but they also hint that not everyone agreed. The fifth paragraph of this chapter reconstructs the likely debate, with some voices arguing for a fighting retreat to a more defensible location, others for a last-ditch attempt at negotiation with the Skrælings, and still others, probably including the women, for simply going home. The eventual decision to leave was a political compromise, driven as much by internal exhaustion as by external threat, and it left scars that would affect the survivors for the rest of their lives. The social fabric of Vinland, woven from the threads of ambition, fear, loyalty, and betrayal, was never strong enough to withstand the pressures it faced. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes that the Vikings left Vinland because their social cohesion had collapsed. A colony that cannot trust its own leaders, that murders its own members, and that flees in panic at the first sound of the bull roar is a colony that has already died inside. The abandonment was merely the formal acknowledgement of a social death that had already occurred. The mystery of Vinland's abandonment has generated a vast scholarly literature over the past century, with historians, archaeologists, and climatologists offering a range of theories that complement and compete with each other. Some emphasize the military defeat, others the economic failure, and still others the climatic downturn known as the Little Ice Age, which began to take hold in the North Atlantic around 1300 and would eventually doom the Greenland colony itself. While the Little Ice Age postdates the Vinland abandonment by several centuries, some scholars argue that the initial climatic instability of the 11th century, including a series of unusually cold winters and stormy summers, may have made Vinland less attractive than it first appeared. The first paragraph of this chapter surveys the historiography of the Vinland question, from the early 20th century debates between the warrior hero school and the economic pragmatist school, to the more recent integration of indigenous perspectives and paleo-environmental data. The consensus that has emerged is that no single factor can explain the abandonment. Rather, it was a perfect storm of multiple stresses that together overwhelmed the colony's capacity to survive. The theory that the Norse were simply not interested in long-term colonization, that their culture was fundamentally oriented toward raiding and trading rather than agricultural settlement, has been advanced by some historians, but it does not hold up to scrutiny. The Norse colonization of Iceland and Greenland demonstrates a clear capacity and appetite for permanent settlement, and the Vinland expeditions were explicitly framed as colonization ventures, with women, livestock, and the intention to stay. The second paragraph of this chapter evaluates and critiques the Viking raider mentality theory, using the archaeological evidence of turf houses, smithies, and burned remains to prove that the Vinland settlers were not a marauding band looking for quick plunder. They were homesteaders who had invested heavily in a permanent future. The reasons for the failure must therefore be sought not in a lack of will but in the objective conditions that made that will impossible to fulfill. The idea that Vinland was abandoned because of a single catastrophic event, a massive Skræling attack that wiped out the colony, or a shipwreck that cut the supply line, has been entertained but lacks archaeological support. The Landsaux Meadows site shows no evidence of destruction by fire or massacre. It appears to have been dismantled and abandoned in an orderly fashion, with the settlers taking their most valuable possessions with them. The third paragraph of this chapter reviews the archaeological evidence for the manner of the abandonment, concluding that it was a planned withdrawal, not a panicked flight. The colonists had time to pack, to load their ships, and to salvage the iron nails from their buildings, a process that would have taken days or weeks. This orderly departure is consistent with a rational decision made under duress, not a sudden catastrophe. The comparative approach, which looks at other failed colonies in history, can illuminate the Vinland case. the English colony at Roanoke in the 1580s, the Scottish colony at Darien in the 1690s, and the French colony at Fort Caroline in the 1560s all failed due to combinations of indigenous resistance, poor logistics, and internal discord, despite having far more state support than Vinland ever enjoyed. The fourth paragraph of this chapter compares Vinland with these later failures, identifying common patterns: an underestimate of native military capability, an overestimate of the colony's economic potential, and a failure to establish a reliable supply chain. Vinland, in this comparative light, is not a unique mystery but a classic example of a colonial overreach, a venture that promised much but delivered only grief. The role of chance and contingency, the unlucky arrow that killed Thorvald, the unfortunate bull that charged the Skrælings traders, the milk that poisoned a potential peace, also deserves consideration. The fifth paragraph of this chapter reflects on the role of accident in history, suggesting that if any one of these micro-events had gone differently, the outcome of Vinland might have been different. What if Thorvald had not killed the sleeping Skrælings? What if the bull had been penned? What if Freydis had not been there to rally the fleeing men? The counterfactuals are unanswerable, but they highlight the fragility of the Vinland enterprise, which hung by a thread that could be cut by a single stone arrowhead. In the end, the abandonment of Vinland was overdetermined. It had so many reasons to fail that it would have been a miracle had it succeeded. The sixth paragraph of this chapter synthesizes the multi-causal explanation, concluding that the Vikings left because they had to leave, driven out by a combination of hostile natives, impossible logistics, internal betrayal, environmental unsuitability, and the simple, crushing weight of being too few, too far, and too poor. The mystery is not why they left, but why they came at all, and why their brief, bright flame of colonization took so long to be extinguished. The long-term consequences of the Vinland abandonment for the Norse world itself are a story of missed opportunity and gradual decline. After the return of Karlsefni's expedition and the atrocity of Freydis' second voyage, the Norse made no further serious attempts to settle North America. The focus of the Greenland colony shifted back to the struggle for survival in an increasingly harsh environment, and the transatlantic frontier that had briefly flared to life went dark. The first paragraph of this chapter examines the post-Vinland period in Greenland, using archaeological and analytic evidence to trace the colony's slow decline. The timber voyages to Markland continued, as we have noted, but they were a pale shadow of the Vinland dream, supplying a basic need without generating the wealth or population growth that a successful colony would have provided. The Vinland venture, by consuming resources and lives, may have actually weakened Greenland, making it more vulnerable to the climatic and economic shocks that were to come. The memory of Vinland in the Norse cultural imagination underwent a transformation over the centuries. In the 13th century, when the sagas were written down, Vinland was already a distant memory, a half-legendary land on the edge of the world, populated by strange creatures and hostile savages. The sagas, as literary works, served to explain and justify the failure. Vinland was a test of faith and courage, and the Norse, though they had failed to settle it, had proven their worth by reaching it. The second paragraph of this chapter explores the literary function of Vinland in the sagas, arguing that the story of the abandonment was shaped by the needs of the 13th century Icelandic elite, who were eager to preserve the memory of their ancestors' exploits while also making sense of a failure that might otherwise have been a source of shame. The Skrælings in the sagas are inflated into monstrous proportions, the better to make the Norse retreat seem prudent rather than cowardly. The physical traces of the Vinland colony, buried under the turf at Longhouses meadows, lay undisturbed for nearly 1,000 years, a silent testament to a forgotten chapter of history. When the site was rediscovered in 1960, it sparked a revolution in our understanding of the Viking Age and forced a rewriting of the history of North American exploration. The third paragraph of this chapter recounts the moment of discovery and its impact, noting that the archaeological confirmation of the sagas transformed Vinland from myth to fact and lent new urgency to the question of why the settlement had failed. The excavations provided material evidence for the logistics, the technology, and the daily life of the Vinland settlers, but they also raised new questions about the Skrælings and the nature of the encounter, questions that archaeologists continue to explore. The genetic and cultural legacy of Vinland in the Americas is essentially nil. Unlike the later European colonies, which left a permanent imprint on the continent's demography, language, and culture, the Vinland colony vanished without a trace, except for a few buried rivets and a handful of butternuts. The fourth paragraph of this chapter reflects on this absence, comparing it with the deep and lasting impact of Columbus's voyages. The Norse failure to establish a permanent colony was, from the perspective of the indigenous peoples, a blessing, preserving their sovereignty and their way of life. From the perspective of the Norse, it was a dead end, a path not taken, a future that never was. The Vikings had the chance to become the first Europeans in the Americas, but they lacked the means to convert that chance into a reality. The lessons of Vinland for later European explorers were, unfortunately, not learned. When the Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French began their own transatlantic ventures in the 15th and 16th centuries, they had no knowledge of the Vinland precedents, and they repeated many of the same mistakes, underestimating indigenous resistance, overestimating the ease of extracting wealth, and struggling with the logistics of long-distance colonization. The fifth paragraph of this chapter contrasts the Vinland failure with the later successes, noting that the key difference was not technology or courage but scale and state support. The later European powers could afford to lose colonies. The Norse could not. The Vinland saga, had it been known to Columbus, might have served as a cautionary tale, but it remained buried in the archives of Iceland until it was too late to matter. The abandonment of Vinland, then, was not just a local retreat. It was a watershed in world history, a hinge moment that could have swung either way but instead swung toward the continued isolation of the Americas. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes by reflecting on the immense contingency of history, the way that a few dozen Skrælings arrows and a few bad decisions in a council of Norsemen shaped the destinies of two continents for the next 500 years. The Vikings left, and the world we know is the result. The mystery of Vinland's abandonment has inspired artists, writers, and filmmakers for generations, each of whom has offered their own interpretation of the story, often using it as a mirror for contemporary concerns. The 19th century Viking revival, fueled by nationalism and romanticism, portrayed the Norse as heroic explorers whose failure in Vinland was a tragic but noble defeat. The Skrælings, when they appeared at all, were demonized as savage obstacles to progress. The first paragraph of this chapter traces the cultural afterlife of Vinland, from Longfellow's poem, The Skeleton in Armor, to the modern graphic novel and anime series, Vinland Saga, which reimagines the story as a meditation on violence, peace, and utopia. Each generation has found its own meaning in the ruins of the Norse colony, and the question of why the Vikings left continues to resonate because it touches on universal themes of ambition, failure, and the encounter with the unknown. The modern archaeological understanding of Vinland, which we have been exploring throughout this series, has gradually shifted the narrative from a story of Viking glory to a story of indigenous resistance and ecological limits. The second paragraph of this chapter examines the impact of the Landseux Meadows discovery on popular culture, noting that the physical reality of the turf houses and the bog iron forge has grounded the Vinland story in a tangible, human scale. The site has become a place of pilgrimage, not just for history enthusiasts, but for indigenous people who see it as a monument to their ancestors' successful defense of their homeland. The interpretive signage at the UNESCO site now includes the Skræling perspective, a shift that reflects the broader decolonization of archaeology and history. The unresolved questions about Vinland, the exact location of Hop, the identity of the Skrælings, the fate of the two captive boys, continue to drive research and speculation. The third paragraph of this chapter surveys the current frontiers of Vinland research, including the search for additional Norse sites using satellite imagery and LiDAR, the ancient DNA studies that are probing the genetic history of the Dorset, Thule, and Beotic populations, and the linguistic analysis that seeks to recover the vanished Skræling languages from the scant evidence of the sagas. Each new discovery, however small, has the potential to rewrite the story and to bring us closer to a full understanding of why the Vikings left. The ethical dimension of the Vinland story has become increasingly important in the 21st century. The traditional focus on the Norse explorers, to the exclusion or minimization of the indigenous peoples, is now recognized as a form of colonial historiography that perpetuates the erasure of Native American agency. The fourth paragraph of this chapter discusses the efforts of indigenous scholars and communities to reclaim the Vinland narrative, to name the Skrælings as ancestors, and to celebrate their victory as a foundational event in the history of indigenous resistance. The abandonment of Vinland, seen through this lens, is not a mystery to be solved but a triumph to be honored. The lessons of Vinland for the modern world are manifold. The story warns against the hubris of technological superiority, the folly of underestimating local knowledge, and the danger of embarking on ambitious ventures without the resources to sustain them. The fifth paragraph of this chapter reflects on these contemporary resonances, noting that the Vinland experience echoes in every failed military intervention, every corporate expansion that overreaches, every attempt to impose a foreign model on an unwilling landscape. The Vikings left Vinland because they encountered limits they could not transcend, and in an age of global ecological and political challenges, that lesson is more relevant than ever. The final, enduring question, why didn't they stay, is not one that can be answered with a single sentence, a single date, or a single name. It is a question that opens up into the whole complexity of human history, into the interplay of culture, environment, technology, and chance. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the penultimate chapter by inviting the viewer to hold all the threads together: the Skræling arrow and the Viking axe, the bellowing bull and the poisoned milk, the courage of Gudrid and the savagery of Freydis, the calculating mind of Karlsefni and the nameless Skræling archer who changed the world. Together, they form the answer. We have reached the end of this first block of our investigation into the mystery of the Vinland abandonment, and the evidence we have assembled points overwhelmingly to a conclusion that is both simple and profound. The Vikings left Vinland because Vinland, for all its grapes and timber and salmon, was not a land they could possess. The Skrælings, with their bows and their bull roarers and their fierce determination to defend their country, made the cost of staying higher than any possible reward. The Atlantic Ocean, that gray, storm-tossed expanse, was a barrier that the Norse could cross but could not tame, and the slender logistical thread that connected Vinland to Greenland was always on the verge of snapping. The internal quarrels and ambitions of the Norse leaders, the greed of Freydis, the caution of Karlsefni, the bad luck of Thorvald, all wove together into a tapestry of failure that no amount of Viking courage could unweave. The first paragraph of this chapter synthesizes the evidence into a coherent causal chain, arguing that the abandonment was a rational, if heartbreaking, response to an impossible situation. The Vikings were not cowards. They were realists who recognized when they were beaten. The counterfactual question, what if they had stayed, is a seductive one, but it must be answered with the cold tools of historical analysis. Even if Karlsefni had managed to negotiate a fragile peace with one Skræling band, even if Freydis had not murdered her partners, even if the supply ships had arrived on time every year, the underlying demographic and ecological constraints would eventually have reasserted themselves. A Vinland colony of a few hundred people, perched on the edge of a continent teeming with indigenous nations, could not have grown into a European America. It would have remained a tiny, vulnerable enclave, dependent on a Greenland that was itself doomed to extinction in the coming centuries. The second paragraph of this chapter bites the bullet on the counterfactual, concluding that the Vinland colony, even under the best of circumstances, was a historical dead end. The Vikings left because there was no viable future for them in North America. The real significance of Vinland lies not in what it was but in what it reveals about the limits of the Viking Age and the power of indigenous resistance. The Skrælings, whose names we do not know and whose language we will never hear, were the first Native Americans to face European invaders and to drive them back into the sea. Their victory, preserved in the biased and fragmentary pages of the Norse sagas, is a testament to the enduring human capacity to defend home and family against overwhelming odds. The third paragraph of this chapter pays tribute to the Skræling warriors, the Dorset and Thule and Beotic ancestors who stood on the beaches of Vinland and said no. Their triumph, though it delayed the European invasion by only 500 years, was a gift of time that allowed the indigenous cultures of the Americas to flourish and evolve in isolation. We are all, in ways we may not fully understand, the inheritors of that gift. The Norse, for their part, took the lessons of Vinland to heart. They did not attempt another transatlantic colony, but they continued to push the boundaries of their world, integrating the North Atlantic into a web of trade and culture that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The fourth paragraph of this chapter reflects on the lasting achievements of the Vinland explorers, even in failure. Leif Erikson, Thorfinn Karlsefni, Gudrid, and even the terrible Freydis are figures who deserve to be remembered not just for what they did but for what they dared. They dreamed of a new world, and though they could not hold it, they proved that it was there, waiting for the day when the ships and the men and the money would finally be sufficient to the task. As we close this first block, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most fascinating mysteries. We have covered a vast terrain, from the ice-filled waters of the Davis Strait to the smoky halls of the Vinland Longhouse, and I hope you have come away with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the past. The story of why the Vikings left Vinland is not just a tale of swords and arrows. It is a story about what it means to be human, to strive and to fail, to encounter the other and to be changed by that encounter. The fifth paragraph here extends an invitation to continue the exploration, to dive even deeper into the details and the debates, and to bring your own perspective to the question. History is not a closed book, it is an ongoing conversation, and your voice is part of it. In the next block, we will delve even further, examining the aftermath of the abandonment, the fate of the Skrælings peoples in the centuries that followed, the dark legacy of the Freydis expedition, the archaeological detective story that finally proved the sagas true, and the modern meaning of Vinland for indigenous peoples and for our understanding of colonialism. I hope you'll join me. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment with your own theories about why the Vikings left. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video. The aftermath of the Vinland abandonment rippled through the Norse world in ways that the sagas only hint at, leaving a legacy of caution, adaptation, and a gradual retreat from the western edge of the known world. When Karlsefni's ships, heavy with timber and furs but light with the weight of failure, returned to Greenland's eastern settlement in the early years of the 11th century, they brought back not only physical cargo but a psychological burden that would shape Norse policy for generations. The Greenland chieftains, who had invested their scarce resources in the Vinland dream, were forced to confront the harsh reality that the western lands, however fertile, were not empty for the taking. The first paragraph of this chapter explores the immediate reception of the returning colonists, reconstructing the conversations that must have taken place in the halls of Brattle and other prominent farms. Eric the Red himself, the visionary who had lured settlers to Greenland with promises of a green land, was by this time dead, having died in an epidemic around 1002 AD, leaving his sons and daughter to manage the consequences of his ambitions. The survivors of Vinland, including Karlsefni and his wife Gudrid, would have faced a mix of admiration for their courage and unspoken questions about their failure. The saga accounts, compiled centuries later, gloss over the awkwardness of this homecoming, but the silence itself speaks volumes. No further large-scale expeditions were mounted, a fact that strongly suggests the Greenland elite had concluded that Vinland was a dangerous distraction from the core task of building a viable colony in Greenland itself. The economic impact of the failed Vinland colony on the fragile Greenland economy was significant, though difficult to quantify with precision. The ships, the iron tools, the livestock, and the labor that had been expended on the Vinland expeditions represented a substantial fraction of Greenland's total capital stock, and their loss or unproductive deployment set back the colony's development. The second paragraph of this chapter uses economic modeling to estimate the scale of the Vinland investment relative to Greenland's GDP, a concept that, while anachronistic in its modern form, captures the real resource allocation decision that the Norse faced. If we assume that Greenland's population was 2,500 and that the average household produced a modest surplus above subsistence, the outfitting of 3 ships with 160 people and their supplies for several years would have required the equivalent of many years' worth of accumulated savings from the wealthiest families. The fact that Karlsefni and his backers were willing to absorb this loss and move on, without attempting a second round of investment, indicates that the expected return on Vinland had fallen below the threshold that would justify the risk. The Greenlanders, like prudent investors, cut their losses and refocused on the local economy, a decision that likely prolonged the survival of the Greenland colony by avoiding further drain. The Freydis expedition, which followed Karlsefni's return and ended in murder and recrimination, represents the final, sordid chapter of the Vinland experiment. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis Eiriksdottir organized a voyage with two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, promising a partnership of equals, only to betray and slaughter them and their followers once they reached Vinland. The third paragraph of this chapter analyzes the Freydis episode as both a symptom and a cause of the Vinland failure. The internal violence reveals a colony that had descended into a Hobbesian state of war of all against all, where the bonds of kinship and law that held Norse society together had frayed to the breaking point. Freydis, who had been the hero of the Skræling battle, now emerged as a monster, an embodiment of the corrosive effects of the Vinland environment on the Norse psyche. When Leif Erikson, now the de facto leader of the Greenland community, learned of the massacre through tortured confessions, he declared Freydis and her descendants accursed, effectively ending her political influence. The Vinland project was now not only a military and economic failure, it was a moral catastrophe that would taint the very idea of transatlantic expansion for generations. The shift from permanent settlement to seasonal resource extraction, which occurred after the Freydis debacle, was a pragmatic adaptation that preserved some of the benefits of the North American landfall without the crippling costs of colonization. The fourth paragraph of this chapter examines the evidence for the Markland voyages, which are mentioned in later Icelandic annals and in a 14th-century description of Greenland. These voyages, undertaken by Greenlanders in need of timber, sailed to the forested coasts of Labrador, where they cut lumber and loaded it onto their ships, avoiding the populated areas further south where the Skrælings had proven so formidable. The Markland voyages were low-profile, low-risk operations that required no permanent infrastructure and minimal contact with indigenous peoples. They represented a rational, if unglamorous, solution to Greenland's chronic timber shortage, and they continued sporadically into the 14th century. The Vinland dream had been a grand vision of a new Norse society in the West. The Markland reality was a modest, mercantile operation that kept Greenland supplied with a vital resource without provoking the kind of resistance that had doomed the colony. The psychological scars of Vinland took longer to heal. The Greenland Norse, having touched the edge of a continent and been repulsed, developed a cultural memory of the Skrælings as a terrifying, almost supernatural threat. The fifth paragraph of this chapter explores the folklore and oral traditions that may have grown up around the Vinland encounters, noting that the saga accounts, with their emphasis on demonic noisemakers and monstrous native warriors, likely drew on a rich vein of campfire stories passed down through the generations. The Skrælings, in this tradition, became bogeymen, figures used to frighten children and to explain the mysterious dangers of the Western Ocean. This cultural memory, reinforced by the later Inuit expansion into Greenland and the violent encounters that accompanied it, contributed to a Norse worldview in which the far west was a place of peril, not promise. The psychological barrier to transatlantic colonization was as powerful, in its own way, as the logistical one. In the long arc of Norse history, the Vinland episode stands as a cautionary tale about the limits of expansion. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the first section of the second block by arguing that the abandonment of Vinland was not a momentary decision, but the beginning of a centuries-long process of withdrawal from the western frontier. The Norse, having tested the limits of their maritime technology and their colonial capacity, drew back to a more defensible perimeter. The Greenland colony, which had been the launchpad for Vinland, would itself eventually succumb to the combined pressures of climate change, Inuit expansion, and economic isolation, but its failure was still centuries in the future when Karlsefni's ships sailed home. In the short term, the abandonment of Vinland was a strategic retreat that preserved Greenland's limited resources for the struggle of daily survival, a decision that the sagas, for all their romanticism, implicitly endorse. the longer-term survival of Norse Greenland after the Vinland abandonment provides a revealing counterpoint to the failure of the Western colony, demonstrating both the resilience and the fragility of the medieval Norse presence in the North Atlantic. For nearly 400 years after Karlsefni's return, the eastern and western settlements of Greenland continued to function, supporting a population that fluctuated between perhaps 1,500 and 2,500 souls, living in stone and turf farmsteads clustered around the deep fjords where the relatively warm water moderated the climate. The first paragraph of this chapter traces the post-Vinland history of Greenland, using archaeological evidence from sites like Bradal, Gardar, and Volsi to reconstruct the daily life of the Norse Greenlanders. They raised cattle and sheep, hunted seals and caribou, fished for cod in the fjords, and maintained a precarious connection with Europe through the export of walrus ivory, polar bear skins, and falcons. The church, centered on the bishopric at Gardar, provided a spiritual and administrative framework that linked the remote settlement to the wider Christian world. The Vinland venture, from this perspective, was a brief, costly aberration in a history that was otherwise characterized by slow, steady adaptation to a marginal environment. The trade networks that sustained Greenland were, however, vulnerable to disruption, and the 13th and 14th centuries brought a series of shocks that progressively weakened the colony. The second paragraph of this chapter examines the external pressures on Norse Greenland, including the decline of the Norwegian merchant fleet following the Black Death, which killed perhaps half of Norway's population in 1349-1350 and severely reduced the market for Greenlandic exports. The rise of elephant ivory from Africa, which began to flood European markets in the 13th century via trans-Saharan trade routes, undercut the price of walrus ivory, the Greenlanders' primary cash commodity. The royal monopoly on trade with Greenland, imposed by the Norwegian crown in the late 13th century, meant that only the king's ships could legally trade with the colony, and when the crown's attention shifted to other priorities, the supply ships became less frequent. By the late 14th century, the Greenlanders were effectively marooned, cut off from the iron, grain, and cultural contact that had sustained their European identity. The Thule Inuit expansion into Greenland, which we have examined in the context of the Vinland encounters, intensified during the 13th and 14th centuries, creating a new front of Skrælings pressure on the Norse settlements. The Thule, moving southward along the west coast of Greenland, occupied the hunting grounds that the Norse had previously used for sealing and caribou hunting, and their presence led to sporadic conflict. The third paragraph of this chapter revisits the Skrælings threat in the Greenland context, using the Icelandic Annals entry for 1379, which records a Skræling attack that killed 18 Norse men and captured 2 boys, to illustrate the ongoing violence. Unlike the Vinland encounters, which were brief and decisive, the Greenland conflict was a slow, grinding attrition that lasted for decades. The Norse, isolated and demographically stagnant, could not sustain the losses, and the outermost farms in the western settlement were gradually abandoned, their inhabitants either retreating to the eastern settlement or perishing. The Skrælings, who had expelled the Norse from Vinland, were now, in effect, expelling them from the margins of their own Greenland home. The climatic deterioration known as the Little Ice Age, which began to affect the North Atlantic around 1300, added an environmental dimension to the Norse crisis. Ice core data from the Greenland ice sheet show a steady decline in temperatures, with particularly severe cold spells in the 14th and 15th centuries. The fourth paragraph of this chapter analyzes the impact of the cooling climate on Norse agriculture, demonstrating that the shorter growing seasons and increased sea ice would have made hay production for winter fodder increasingly difficult, leading to livestock deaths and food shortages. The advancing ice also made the sea routes to Europe more hazardous, contributing to the isolation of the colony. The Thule, with their adapted technology, dog sleds, kayaks, and seal hunting harpoons, were much better equipped to handle the colder conditions, and they expanded into areas that the Norse were forced to abandon. The Little Ice Age was, in effect, a massive environmental shift that favored the Skræling way of life over the European one, tipping the balance of power decisively toward the indigenous population. The final decades of the Norse Greenland colony, from about 1400 to the mid-15th century, are shrouded in archaeological mystery. The last written record is a letter concerning a wedding at Volsey Church in 1408, a document that describes a perfectly normal Christian marriage ceremony, with no hint of the crisis that was about to engulf the settlement. The fifth paragraph of this chapter examines the archaeological evidence for the end of the eastern settlement, including the excavation of the farm beneath the sand at Gus in the 1990s, which revealed a farmstead that was occupied until the very end, with the final inhabitants butchering their last livestock and perhaps starving in their own home. The absence of a destruction layer suggests that there was no single cataclysmic event, no Inuit massacre, no epidemic, but rather a gradual process of attrition, with the population shrinking until it could no longer sustain itself. Some Norse may have assimilated into Thule communities, as Inuit oral traditions suggest. Others may have attempted a desperate evacuation to Iceland or Europe, though no record of such a voyage has survived. The extinction of the Norse Greenland colony around 1450 AD marked the final end of the medieval European presence in the New World. The sixth paragraph of this chapter draws a direct line from Vinland to the fall of Greenland, arguing that the same factors that caused the abandonment of Vinland, Skrælings resistance, logistical impossibility, ecological mismatch, and internal fragility, played out over a longer timescale in Greenland. The Vinland venture had been the high water mark of Norse expansionism, the furthest reach of the Viking Age, and its failure foreshadowed the eventual retreat of the Norse from the entire North Atlantic frontier. When the Danes returned to Greenland in the 18th century, they found only the Inuit and the ruins of a vanished people, a testament to the limits of European colonial ambition in the centuries before the Age of Discovery. The Skrælings perspective on the Vinland encounter, which we have attempted to reconstruct from archaeological evidence, oral traditions, and ethnographic analogy, is the missing half of the story, the indigenous counter-narrative that the Norse sagas only hint at through a fog of incomprehension and fear. To understand why the Vikings left, we must try to see the Norse as the Skrælings saw them, as strange, dangerous beings who arrived in giant floating houses, who wore shiny, impenetrable skins, and who brought with them terrifying, bellowing beasts. The first paragraph of this chapter immerses the viewer in a Skræling worldview, drawing on Dorset and Thule cosmology as reconstructed from artifacts, rock art, and the traditions of later Inuit and Innu peoples. The Skrælings inhabited a universe in which the boundaries between the human, animal, and spirit worlds were porous, in which shamans could transform into bears or birds, and in which the arrival of unprecedented strangers from the sea would have been interpreted as a spiritual event of immense significance. The Norse, with their pale skin and their glittering metal, might have been seen as spirits or as a new kind of human, and the initial trade in red cloth suggests an attempt to incorporate them into existing exchange networks, to domesticate the supernatural. The initial peaceful trade, described in the saga of Eric the Red as a barter of red woolen cloth for furs, was a moment of potential that could have led to a lasting relationship. The Skrælings, as experienced traders with networks that stretched across the subarctic, would have been eager to acquire the vivid red fabric, a color that may have held ritual significance associated with blood, life, and spiritual power. The second paragraph of this chapter analyzes the trade from the Skrælings side, arguing that the Norse cloth was valued not merely as a utilitarian item but as a prestige good, a marker of status and spiritual connection. The Skræling demand was so intense that they were willing to trade their finest pelts for strips of cloth no wider than a finger, a fact that the Norse, with their profit-seeking mentality, eagerly exploited. However, this asymmetry of desire also created a dangerous dependency. When the cloth ran out, and when the Norse refused to trade their precious iron weapons, the Skrælings may have felt cheated, manipulated, or even deliberately provoked. The economic logic of the trade, which the Norse saw as a straightforward exchange, was embedded in a Skræling framework of gift-giving and reciprocity that the Norse violated, consciously or not. The bull incident, which the sagas present as a turning point, looms even larger from a Skræling perspective. A Dorset or ancestral Beotic person had never seen a domestic bull, an animal that stands over 1.5 meters at the shoulder, weighs more than 500 kilograms, and bellows with a sound that vibrates through the earth. The third paragraph of this chapter explores the bull's impact on the Skrælings psyche, suggesting that it would have been perceived as a terrifying monster, perhaps a spirit animal under the control of the Norse, unleashed deliberately to cause chaos. The sagas described the Skrælings fleeing in terror when the bull charged out of the forest, and this flight was not a moment of cowardice but a rational response to an incomprehensible threat. When the Skrælings returned in force, with their bows and their bull roarers, they were not simply retaliating for a broken trade agreement. They were responding to what they perceived as a supernatural act of aggression, a declaration of spiritual warfare. The Norse, oblivious to this interpretation, saw only a random animal incursion that the Skrælings had overreacted to, and the cultural gulf widened to an unbridgeable chasm. The Skræling military response, which we have analyzed from a tactical perspective, was also a deeply spiritual operation. The bull roarers, those whirring slats of wood that made the ground seem to shake, were not just noisemakers. They were sacred instruments used to invoke spirit powers and to cleanse the land of supernatural pollution. The fourth paragraph of this chapter examines the role of the shaman in Skræling warfare, drawing on ethnographic studies of Inuit and other circumpolar peoples to argue that the battle was led by spiritual specialists who interpreted the omens, communed with the ancestors, and directed the warriors to attack at the moment when the spirits were most favorable. The Norse, with their Christian prayers and their crosses, were fighting a spiritual war they did not even know they were in, and the Skrælings, who understood the battlefield as a place where the physical and the metaphysical converged, held the advantage. The flight of the Norsemen, and the terrifying countercharge of Freydis with her exposed breast, must have appeared to the Skrælings as a chaotic eruption of unfamiliar spiritual forces, enough to cause even the bravest shaman to order a retreat and reassess the situation. The decision to continue the war of attrition, rather than to seek a negotiated peace, was a strategic choice by the Skræling leadership. The fifth paragraph of this chapter argues that the Skrælings, having tested the Norse in battle and found them vulnerable, made a collective decision to press the attack until the strangers left. The capture of the two Skræling boys by Karlsefni would have been a devastating blow, an act of kidnapping that demanded vengeance, and the continued Norse presence, with its environmental destruction and its unpredictable violence, was an existential threat that could not be tolerated. The Skrælings, like indigenous peoples throughout history who have faced colonial incursions, understood that a partial resistance would only invite further encroachment, and that only a total expulsion would secure their lands. This strategic clarity, born of a deep knowledge of their own environment and a fierce commitment to their way of life, was the key to their victory. The memory of the Vinland victory, preserved in the oral traditions of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, and the Inuit, became part of the indigenous cultural heritage of the North Atlantic. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the Skræling-centered analysis by noting that the story of the pale strangers who came and were driven away was told and retold around campfires for centuries, shaping the way that later indigenous peoples responded to the next wave of European arrivals. The Beothuk policy of avoidance, the Mi'kmaq caution, and the Inuit readiness to fight all drew on a deep historical memory of the first contact and the first resistance. The Skrælings, in this sense, never really disappeared. Their victory in Vinland became part of the indigenous DNA, a foundational story of survival and sovereignty that would echo through the ages. The archaeological confirmation of the Vinland sagas, culminating in the discovery of Longhouses meadows in 1960, transformed the abandonment question from a literary puzzle into a scientific inquiry, providing physical evidence that both validated the saga narratives and deepened the mystery of why the colony failed. The Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad, who had spent years tracing the Viking routes across the North Atlantic, was guided to the site on Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula by a local fisherman, George Decker, who had noticed the peculiar mounds near Epaves Bay. The first paragraph of this chapter recounts the story of the discovery in vivid detail, from Ingstad's initial excitement to the painstaking excavations carried out by his wife, the archaeologist and Stein Ingstad, between 1961 and 1968. The team uncovered 8 turf and sod buildings, including 3 dwelling halls, a smithy with a stone forge and a slag pit, and a carpenter's workshop, all laid out in a pattern unmistakably Norse. The artifacts were sparse but decisive: a bronze ring-headed pin of a type used in 11th century Norway and Iceland, a stone oil lamp, a spindle whorl for spinning wool, and a handful of iron ship rivets. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from the smithy and the floor layers produced dates clustering between 980 and 1020 AD, a perfect match for the saga chronology of the Vinland voyages. The material evidence from Landseux Meadows provides crucial insights into the economic and technological base of the Vinland colony, revealing both its strengths and its fatal weaknesses. The smithy, with its iron slag and bog or fragments, proves that the Norse were smelting local iron, an impressive feat of adaptation that showed their intention to stay and their ability to exploit local resources. However, the scale of iron production was tiny, sufficient only for small-scale repairs and the manufacture of nails, not for the production of weapons or armor on a scale that could equip a militia to fight the Skrælings. The second paragraph of this chapter analyzes the iron working evidence in detail, using metallurgical studies of the slag and the few surviving iron objects to demonstrate that the Vinland colony was technologically self-sufficient only at the most basic level, and that it remained dependent on imported iron from Greenland for any significant military or construction needs. This technological dependency was a critical vulnerability, a bottleneck that the Skræling attacks could exploit by simply making iron replacement impossible. The butternuts and the butternut burrow found in the Norse midden at Landseux Meadows are among the most tantalizing artifacts, because they prove that the Norse explored far beyond the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, reaching at least as far south as the Miramichi River in New Brunswick, where the butternut tree grows. The third paragraph of this chapter uses the butternut evidence to reconstruct the scale of Norse exploration, arguing that the Vinland of the sagas, the land of wild grapes and self-sown wheat, was not the foggy, subarctic environment of Landseux Meadows but the warmer, more fertile shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, perhaps as far south as Prince Edward Island or Nova Scotia. The base camp at Landseux Meadows was likely a gateway, a northern anchorage from which the Norse launched their exploratory voyages into the richer southern lands, just as the sagas describe Karlsefni sailing south to a place called Hop. The southern voyages brought the Norse into contact with a different, perhaps larger, Skræling population, increasing the probability of conflict and confirming that the indigenous presence was not limited to the northern coasts. The absence of a destruction layer at Landseux Meadows is one of the most important archaeological facts for understanding the abandonment. Unlike a site that was sacked and burned, the Norse settlement shows signs of an orderly withdrawal. The buildings were dismantled, the valuable iron nails were pulled out and taken away, and the site was essentially cleaned up before departure. The fourth paragraph of this chapter examines the abandonment evidence in detail, comparing it with other known Norse sites in Greenland and Iceland that were abandoned in haste or destroyed by fire. The orderly nature of the Vinland departure strongly supports the saga narrative of a deliberate decision, made under duress but not in panic, to cut losses and return to Greenland. The colonists had time to pack their belongings, load their ships, and salvage their most valuable materials, a process that would have taken weeks. This was a retreat, but it was a controlled, strategic retreat, not a rout. The ongoing search for additional Norse sites in North America, using advanced technologies like LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite imagery analysis, has so far failed to yield a confirmed second settlement, a fact that underscores the extreme brevity and small scale of the Norse presence. The fifth paragraph of this chapter surveys the current state of the search, discussing the controversial Point Rosie site in southwestern Newfoundland, which initially showed promise with magnetometry anomalies and possible bog iron, but which subsequent excavations have largely dismissed as a natural feature or perhaps a Dorset campsite. The failure to find more sites suggests that the Vinland colony was a single base operation, a toehold on the continent that never expanded into a network of farms and outposts. The Skræling resistance was so effective that it prevented the Norse from replicating the settlement pattern that had worked in Iceland and Greenland, where individual families had spread out across the landscape. In Vinland, the Norse were bottled up in one vulnerable location, unable to disperse and unable to grow. The archaeological legacy of Vinland, though physically modest, is immense in its historical significance. The The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes that the material evidence from longhouses meadows, combined with the saga texts and the environmental data, provides a coherent picture of why the Vikings left. They left because their base was too small, their iron supply too fragile, their exploration too constrained, and their enemy too determined. The archaeology does not contradict the sagas, it enriches them, grounding the literary drama in the hard realities of turf walls, bog iron, and butternuts. The mystery of the abandonment is, in a sense, solved by the very soil of Newfoundland. The comparative analysis of Vinland with other failed and successful colonies in history provides a framework for understanding the abandonment not as a unique event, but as a classic case of colonial overreach, a pattern that would repeat itself in many times and places. The most obvious comparison is with the English colony at Roanoke, established on the coast of present-day North Carolina in 1585 and abandoned under mysterious circumstances by 1590. Like Vinland, Roanoke was a privately financed venture, undersupplied from the mother country, located in a region inhabited by well-organized indigenous peoples, and plagued by internal disputes and external violence. The first paragraph of this chapter draws a detailed parallel between Vinland and Roanoke, noting the similar arcs of initial hope, deteriorating relations with natives, and eventual disappearance. The Roanoke colonists, like the Vinland settlers, found themselves trapped between an unreliable supply chain and a hostile environment, and their ultimate fate, whether they starved, were killed, or assimilated into local tribes, mirrors the possible fates of any Vinland Norsemen who did not make it back to the ships. The Scottish colony at Darien, established on the Isthmus of Panama in 1698, offers another comparative case study. The Darien scheme was a national enterprise, backed by a significant fraction of Scotland's liquid capital, and it aimed to establish a trading entrepot that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The second paragraph of this chapter compares the economic logic of Darien with that of Vinland, showing how both ventures were driven by a desire to break into a lucrative market: the fur and timber trade for Vinland, the transoceanic trade for Darien, and how both were undone by a combination of indigenous resistance, disease, and logistical failure. The Darien colony, despite having far greater financial resources and state backing than Vinland, collapsed within 2 years, a testament to the immense difficulty of long-distance colonization even for a relatively advanced early modern state. If Scotland, with all its 17th-century resources, could not sustain a colony in Panama, it is no surprise that a handful of 11th-century Greenlanders could not sustain one in Newfoundland. The successful colonies of the early modern period, Jamestown, Plymouth, Quebec, succeeded where Vinland failed not because their settlers were braver or more skilled, but because they had access to resources that Karlsefni could only dream of. The third paragraph of this chapter contrasts the resource base of the Vinland colony with that of Jamestown, founded by the Virginia Company in 1607. Jamestown, despite horrific initial mortality, survived because it was backed by a joint stock company that could raise funds from thousands of investors, because it received regular supply ships from England, and because the English crown was willing to commit military force to protect its colonial interests. Vinland had none of these advantages. The Greenland economy could not support a colony 3,000 kilometers away, the Norwegian king had no interest in Western expansion, and the Norse world lacked the financial instruments, insurance, bonds, stock markets, that allowed the early modern Europeans to spread the risk of colonial ventures across a broad base of capital. Vinland was a frontier venture in an age before the state or the market was capable of supporting such ventures. The Portuguese colonization of the Atlantic islands, Madeira, the Azores, and the Cape Verde archipelago, provides an instructive example of successful Norse-style colonization that succeeded precisely because the islands were uninhabited. The fourth paragraph of this chapter compares the Norse settlement of Iceland and the Faroes with the Portuguese colonization of Madeira, which began in the 1420s. Both involved the transfer of European agricultural systems to previously empty islands, and both succeeded because there was no indigenous resistance. Vinland, by contrast, was not an empty island but a populated continent, and the Skrælings, unlike the non-existent natives of the mid-Atlantic islands, were a formidable military obstacle. The comparison underscores a crucial point: the Norse colonial model, which had worked so well in the empty landscapes of the North Atlantic, was fundamentally unsuited to the conquest of inhabited territories. The Vikings were colonizers of wilderness, not conquerors of peoples, and when they encountered a people who refused to be conquered, their model broke down. The psychological and cultural factors that contributed to colonial success or failure are also illuminated by the comparative approach. The fifth paragraph of this chapter examines the role of ideology in sustaining colonial ventures, noting that the later European colonies were driven by a combination of religious mission, national rivalry, and a belief in European superiority that provided a powerful motivational framework. The Norse, who were themselves recent converts to Christianity and who still lived in a world where the pagan gods were a living memory, lacked the ideological fervor that would later animate the Spanish conquistadors and the Puritan settlers. The Vinland colony was a pragmatic, commercial enterprise, not a crusade, and when the commercial logic failed, there was no transcendent purpose to sustain the commitment. The Skrælings, fighting for their homes and their way of life, had a moral clarity that the Norse, fighting for profit, could not match. The lesson of comparative colonial history is that the Vinland abandonment was overdetermined by structural factors that no amount of individual heroism could have overcome. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the comparative analysis by stating that the question of why the Vikings left is, in the end, less interesting than the question of why they managed to stay as long as they did. Given the immense obstacles they faced, the 3-year survival of the Vinland colony, with a baby born and a smithy in operation, is a remarkable achievement, a testament to the courage and resilience of Karlsefni, Gudrid, and their companions. The abandonment was not a failure of character but a failure of conditions, a recognition that the world was not yet ready for a permanent bridge between Europe and the Americas. The psychological trauma of the Vinland experience left deep scars on the individuals who lived through it, and the sagas, despite their literary conventions, preserve glimpses of the emotional toll that the failed colony exacted. Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, the wife of Karlsefni and the mother of the first European child born in the Americas, is a figure whose quiet strength and spiritual depth emerge from the saga pages as a counterpoint to the violence around her. The first paragraph of this chapter focuses on Gudrid's post-Vinland life, tracing her pilgrimage to Rome, where she reportedly met the Pope, and her eventual retirement as a nun and anchoress in Iceland. The sagas present Gudrid as a woman of extraordinary faith, whose visions during the Skræling battle were interpreted as divine protection, and whose later life was a testament to the power of Christian piety to transcend trauma. Yet even this hagiographic portrait hints at the cost of Vinland. Gudrid, the woman who had seen the New World, who had buried friends and faced death, spent her final years in a stone cell, praying and remembering. The Vinland experience, for her, was not an adventure but a crucible that forged a saint but also consumed a piece of her soul. Karlsefni's post-Vinland career was more outwardly successful but no less marked by the failure. After returning to Iceland, he purchased the estate of Glomber in the Skagafjord Valley, a rich and prestigious farm where he lived as a respected chieftain. The second paragraph of this chapter examines Karlsefni's later life, using the saga genealogies and the archaeological remains of Glomber to reconstruct the world of a man who had touched the edge of a continent, and then retreated to the familiar comforts of Icelandic pastoral life. The sagas present Karlsefni as a wise and prosperous figure, but they also record that he never returned to Vinland, never attempted another transatlantic venture, and never, so far as we know, spoke publicly of his experiences. The silence of Karlsefni, the absence of any boastful sagas about his Vinland exploits, suggests a man who carried the weight of his decision to abandon the colony with him to the grave. He had saved his family and his fortune, but he had also presided over the failure of the greatest Norse exploration of all time, and that contradiction must have gnawed at him. Freydis Eiriksdottir, the most violent and controversial figure of the Vinland saga, suffered a darker fate. After her return to Greenland and the exposure of her murders, she was declared accursed by Leif Erikson, and her reputation was destroyed. The third paragraph of this chapter traces the legacy of Freydis, noting that the sagas present her as a cautionary figure, a woman whose ambition and ruthlessness led her to commit unspeakable acts, and whose name became a byword for treachery. Yet the saga treatment of Freydis is complex. She is also the hero of the Skrælings battle, the woman who, by her courage, saved the colony when the men had fled. This duality, hero and monster, protector and murderer, reflects the moral ambiguity of the Vinland experience itself, an experience that pushed human beings to extremes and revealed the dark capacities that lurked beneath the surface of civilization. Freydis, in her terrible glory, is the human face of the Vinland failure, a reminder that the colony was not just defeated by external enemies but was also consumed by its own inner demons. The two Skrælings boys, captured and taken to Europe by Karlsefni, represent the most poignant and invisible victims of the Vinland encounter. The fourth paragraph of this chapter imagines their fate, drawing on what little the sagas tell us: that they were baptized and taught Norse, that they spoke of a Skræling king, and that they then disappear from the record. The boys, likely Dorset or ancestro-biotic children, were torn from their families, their language, and their world, and forced to serve as living specimens of a newly encountered people. Their testimony about the Skrælings land and its ruler, filtered through the language they had been forced to learn and the trauma they had endured, was the first ethnographic report on Native Americans in European history, a report that may have influenced the decision to abandon Vinland by revealing the depth of the indigenous presence. The boys died unknown, unmourned in the saga record, their graves unmarked, their names unrecorded. Their silent suffering is the hidden cost of the Vinland adventure, a cost borne by the most vulnerable. The children of Vinland, particularly Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European born in the Americas, represent a different kind of legacy. Snorri, who was 3 years old when the colony was abandoned, grew up in Iceland, inheriting Glomber and becoming a prominent chieftain. The fifth paragraph of this chapter traces the lineage of Snorri, which produced bishops, including Orke Runolfsson, and other notable Icelanders, weaving the Vinland story into the fabric of Icelandic Christian history. Snorri, who would have had no conscious memory of his birthplace, nevertheless carried the mark of Vinland in his name and his lineage. The fact that the sagas were written by his descendants, who had a vested interest in celebrating their ancestors' role in the exploration, shaped the narrative in ways that we must constantly bear in mind. The Vinland sagas are not objective history, they are family stories, designed to honor the ancestors and to explain, and perhaps to excuse, their ultimate failure. The psychological legacy of Vinland for the Norse community, as a whole, was a deep-seated caution about Western expansion that lasted for centuries. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the psychological analysis by arguing that the Vinland trauma became part of the Norse collective unconscious, a memory of a paradise lost, guarded by monstrous Skrælings, that was best left to the mists of legend. The sagas, by transforming the failure into a story of heroic struggle against overwhelming odds, performed a kind of cultural therapy, allowing the Norse to remember Vinland without being crushed by the memory of defeat. The abandonment, in this psychological reading, was not just a strategic retreat, it was an act of collective repression, a decision to forget the way to the new world in order to live more comfortably in the old. The role of climate in the Vinland abandonment, while often treated as a secondary factor, deserves careful attention because the medieval warm period, which made the initial voyages possible, was a temporary climatic window that was already beginning to close by the time the Norse attempted to settle. The period from roughly 950 to 1250 AD was characterized by unusually warm temperatures in the North Atlantic, a warmth that allowed the Norse to colonize Greenland and to explore the waters of the Canadian Arctic and Newfoundland with relative ease. Ice core data from the Greenland ice sheet, analyzed for oxygen isotopes that track past temperatures, show a clear warm peak around 1000 AD, the very moment of the Vinland voyages. The first paragraph of this chapter examines the paleoclimatic evidence in detail, using the GISB2 and DYE3 ice cores to reconstruct the weather conditions that Leif, Thorvald, and Karlsefni would have experienced. The warm seas meant less ice, calmer passages, and a longer growing season in Vinland, all of which contributed to the initial optimism that the land was a green paradise. The Norse did not realize that they were riding a climatic wave that was about to crest and break. The subsequent cooling trend, which began in the 12th century and accelerated into the Little Ice Age, made the North Atlantic crossing increasingly hazardous, and would have made the maintenance of a Vinland colony progressively more difficult even if the Skrælings had not existed. The second paragraph of this chapter traces the climatic deterioration through the 11th and 12th centuries, using sediment cores from Baffin Bay and the Labrador Sea to document the increase in sea ice and the drop in sea surface temperatures. A Vinland colony, already struggling with indigenous resistance and logistical fragility, would have found its supply lines cut by ice for longer periods each year, its livestock dying in harsher winters, and its inhabitants increasingly isolated. The climatic window that had allowed the Norse to reach Finland was slamming shut, and the abandonment, when it came, was partly a response to this environmental shift. The Vikings left not only because of the Skrælings but because the weather was turning against them, making an already marginal enterprise impossibly risky. The impact of climate on the Skrælings themselves was different, and it helps to explain why they were so resistant to the Norse presence. The Dorset culture, which had thrived during the cooler centuries before the medieval warm period, was already under stress from the warming trend, which altered the sea ice patterns on which their seal hunting economy depended. The third paragraph of this chapter explores the climatic stresses on the Dorset, using archaeological evidence of settlement abandonment and dietary shifts to suggest that the Skrælings of Vinland were a people already facing environmental challenges when the Norse arrived. The warming trend may have brought them into more intense competition for resources, making them more aggressive in defending their territories against intruders. The Norse, in this scenario, arrived not at a moment of indigenous plenty but at a moment of indigenous stress, a situation that made conflict more likely and peace more elusive. The Skrælings, fighting for survival in a changing world, had no margin for accommodating strangers who competed for the same seals and caribou. The Little Ice Age, which eventually doomed the Greenland Norse, was the final climatic chapter of the Vinland story. The fourth paragraph of this chapter connects the Vinland abandonment to the later extinction of the Greenland colony, arguing that the same climatic forces that made Vinland unattractive in the 11th century made Greenland unlivable in the 15th. The Norse, by withdrawing from Vinland, bought themselves time in Greenland, but the relentless cooling of the Little Ice Age eventually caught up with them. The Skrælings, now the Thule Inuit, who had adapted to the cold over millennia, were the beneficiaries of this climatic shift, expanding their range as the Norse retreated. The climate, in the long run, was an ally of the indigenous peoples and an enemy of the European settlers, a pattern that would repeat itself in other colonial contexts but was here writ large over the entire North Atlantic. The modern relevance of the Vinland climatic story is impossible to ignore in an era of rapid global warming. The fifth paragraph of this chapter reflects on the contemporary implications of the Vinland climate data, noting that the medieval warm period was a natural climate fluctuation, driven by changes in solar activity and ocean circulation, whereas the current warming is anthropogenic and far more rapid. The Norse experience in Vinland, however, offers a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of human societies to climate change, even when that change is slow and natural. The Vinland colony was a bet on a stable climate, and the climate did not cooperate. Modern societies, which are making similar bets on the assumption of climatic stability, would do well to heed the lesson. The climatic dimension of the Vinland abandonment, when integrated with the other factors we have examined, completes the picture of a colony that was caught in a perfect storm of challenges. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the climatic analysis by stating that the Vikings left Vinland because they had the misfortune to colonize at the tail end of a warm period, in a land that was about to become much less hospitable. The grapes and the butternuts were a temporary gift of the climate, not a permanent feature of the landscape, and the Skrælings, who had survived many climatic shifts, knew the land's true nature better than the newcomers. The Norse, in their optimism, mistook a climatic anomaly for a permanent condition, and when the anomaly faded, so did their hopes of a Vinland home. The technological dimension of the Vinland failure, which we have touched on in the context of iron production and ship logistics, extends to the broader toolkit that the Norse brought across the Atlantic and its inadequacy for the challenges of the New World. The Norse agricultural package, cattle, sheep, goats, and the associated iron plows, scythes, and hayforks, was a sophisticated system that had been fine-tuned for the subarctic environments of Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, but it was essentially a European import that required a European landscape to function. The first paragraph of this chapter analyzes the Norse toolkit in exhaustive detail, cataloging the tools found at Longhouses meadows and comparing them with the indigenous toolkit of the Skrælings. The Norse iron axe, while superb for felling trees and building houses, was heavy, required constant sharpening, and was irreplaceable if broken. The Skræling stone axe, made from chert or quartzite, was lighter, could be manufactured in hours from local materials, and was perfectly adequate for the tasks of woodworking and butchering that the Skrælings needed. The technological advantage of iron, so decisive in European warfare, was less significant in the context of a subsistence economy where local abundance and ease of replacement mattered more than raw material properties. The Norse failure to adopt Skræling technology, which we have discussed as a cultural rigidity, also had a technological dimension. The Skrælings possessed a range of tools and techniques: the kayak, the toggling harpoon, the dog's lead, the tailored skin clothing, that were superbly adapted to the North American environment, and the Norse had centuries of contact in Greenland during which they could have learned these techniques. The second paragraph of this chapter explores this technological conservatism, asking why the Norse never built a kayak, never used a harpoon with a detachable head, and never adopted the Inuit parka, which was far warmer than their woolen cloaks. The answer lies partly in the Norse perception of the Skrælings as inferior beings whose technology was unworthy of imitation, and partly in the lack of the necessary raw materials: the driftwood of the right kind, the sealskins, the sinew, and the skilled knowledge to work them. The Norse were trapped in their own technological paradigm, and their inability to learn from the Skrælings was a critical factor in their failure to adapt. The communication technology, or lack thereof, was another critical gap. The Norse had no writing system other than the runic alphabet, which was used for short inscriptions on stone and wood, not for recording detailed ethnographic or navigational information. The third paragraph of this chapter examines the Norse information technology, arguing that the inability to create accurate maps, to record the Skræling language, or to transmit complex instructions to subsequent expeditions severely hampered the colonial project. The sagas, which were oral traditions for centuries before they were written down, are our only record, and they are full of gaps, contradictions, and fantastical elements. The Norse, in effect, were operating in an information vacuum, relying on the memory and storytelling skills of a few dozen individuals to preserve the knowledge of Vinland. When those individuals died or forgot, the knowledge was lost, and the way to Vinland was closed. The Skrælings, who had a rich oral tradition and a deep spatial memory encoded in their place names and their stories, had no such problem. Their knowledge of the land was constantly refreshed and shared. The military technology comparison, which we have covered from a tactical perspective, can be extended to the strategic level. The Norse long-range weapon, the bow, was a secondary arm in their military system, used mainly for hunting and skirmishing, while the Skrælings made the bow and arrow the centerpiece of their warfighting doctrine. The fourth paragraph of this chapter examines the bow technology of both sides, noting that the Norse bow was typically a simple self-bow made of yew or elm, while the Skræling bow was a more complex composite design, reinforced with sinew, better suited to the cold and damp of the coastal environment. The Norse arrows were tipped with iron, which was heavy and expensive. The Skræling arrows were tipped with stone, which was light, cheap, and razor-sharp. In a contest of archery, which is what the Vinland battles largely were, the Skrælings had the technological advantage, a fact that the Norse, with their emphasis on shock combat, were slow to recognize. The domestic technology of the Norse, the turf longhouse, the central hearth, the box bed, was adequate for the Vinland climate, but it required a constant input of labor to maintain. The fifth paragraph of this chapter uses the architectural evidence from Longhouses meadows to show that the Norse buildings were well built but labor-intensive, requiring regular repair of the turf walls and the sod roofs. The Skræling dwellings, whether the Dorset semi-subterranean houses or the Thule igloos, were more mobile, more energy efficient, and better suited to a people who needed to move with the seasons. The Norse commitment to a fixed, European-style house was another manifestation of their cultural rigidity, a refusal to adopt the local building techniques that would have made their lives easier and their colony more sustainable. The technological gap between the Norse and the Skrælings was not, in the end, a simple matter of iron beating stone. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the technological analysis by arguing that the Vikings left Vinland because their technology, while advanced in some respects, was poorly matched to the specific demands of the environment and the enemy. The Skrælings, with their appropriate technology, were able to outcompete the Norse on their own ground, using the weapons and tools that millennia of evolution had perfected. The Vinland failure is a lesson in the limits of technological superiority, a reminder that the right tool for the job is the one that fits the local conditions, not the one that glitters the brightest. The cultural memory of Vinland, preserved in the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the North Atlantic, offers a fascinating counterpoint to the written sagas, a Skræling narrative that has been passed down through generations and that, in some cases, may still survive in fragmentary form. The Beothuk people of Newfoundland, who were the last full-blooded indigenous inhabitants of the island, had a rich tradition of stories about the ancient past, some of which were recorded by European settlers and ethnographers before the Beothuk were tragically extinguished in the 19th century. The first paragraph of this chapter examines the Beothuk oral traditions, particularly the stories collected from Shanadithit, the last known Beothuk, who died in 1829. Shanadithit spoke of a time when strange white men had come to the island, men who were driven away by the Beothuk ancestors after a great battle. This story, while impossible to verify as a direct memory of the Vinland encounter, is tantalizingly consistent with the saga accounts of the Skræling conflict, and it suggests that the Beothuk may have preserved a folk memory of the Norse visit for nearly 800 years. The Inuit traditions of the Kablanat, or white men, which were recorded by Danish explorers and missionaries in Greenland in the 18th and 19th centuries, provide another layer of indigenous memory. The second paragraph of this chapter analyzes the Kablanat stories, drawing on the collections of Knud Rasmussen and Heinrich Rink, which describe encounters with bearded strangers who came in large wooden boats, who possessed shining metal, and who were sometimes traded with, sometimes fought. Some stories tell of a Kablanat man who was adopted into an Inuit community and taught the people new skills, while others describe a battle in which the Inuit used their bows to drive the Kablanat away. These stories, while not datable to the Vinland period with any precision, fit the pattern of Norse-Inuit interaction that the archaeological record documents, and they represent the Skræling side of the story, the version of events that the sagas, with their Eurocentric bias, could never capture. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, whose ancestors may have been among the Skrælings encountered by the Norse at Hop, also have traditions that could be related to the Vinland encounter. The third paragraph of this chapter explores the Mi'kmaq oral history, which includes stories of a great flood, of ancient migrations, and of encounters with strange beings, but which does not contain an explicit reference to the Norse. The absence of a clear Vinland memory in Mi'kmaq tradition may reflect the brevity of the Norse presence in the south, or it may be that the memory was incorporated into more general stories about the spirit world and the ancestors, losing its specific historical referent. The difficulty of matching oral traditions to specific historical events is a challenge that all scholars of indigenous history must confront, but the very existence of these traditions, with their themes of resistance and survival, testifies to the enduring power of the Skræling victory. The modern indigenous reclamation of the Vinland story, which we have discussed in the context of the Skræling legacy, is a powerful cultural movement that seeks to center the indigenous perspective and to celebrate the Skræling victory as a foundational event. The fourth paragraph of this chapter profiles some of the contemporary indigenous scholars, artists, and activists who are working to bring the Skræling story to a wider audience. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the Beothuk story is taught in schools, and the L'Anse aux Meadows site now includes interpretive panels that discuss the Skræling resistance. The Inuit of Greenland and Nunavut have incorporated the Kablanat encounters into their own historical narratives, framing the Norse as transient intruders who were ultimately expelled. This reclamation is not just an academic exercise, it is an act of cultural sovereignty, a way of asserting that the indigenous peoples of the North Atlantic were not passive victims of history but active agents who shaped their own destinies. The contrast between the written Norse record and the oral Skræling record raises profound questions about the nature of history and memory. The fifth paragraph of this chapter reflects on the epistemology of the Vinland encounter, arguing that both the sagas and the indigenous traditions are partial, biased, and constructed to serve the needs of the communities that produced them. The sagas are not objective truth, and neither are the oral traditions, but together they form a stereo image that gives us a richer, more complete understanding of the past. The challenge for the historian is to balance these two sources, to weigh the written word against the spoken memory, and to acknowledge the gaps and silences that can never be filled. The cultural memory of Vinland, in both its Norse and Skræling forms, is the ultimate legacy of the encounter, a legacy that continues to shape the identities and the politics of the North Atlantic region. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the cultural memory analysis by stating that the question of why the Vikings left is not just a historical puzzle. It is a living question, with different answers depending on who is asking and why. For the descendants of the Norse, the abandonment is a story of loss and limitation. For the descendants of the Skrælings, it is a story of triumph and survival. Both stories are true, and both deserve to be told. The decision-making process that led to the Vinland abandonment, while recorded in the sagas only in summary form, can be reconstructed in some detail by analyzing the options available to Karlsefni and the pressures that bore on him. The first and most obvious option was to stay and fight, to reinforce the settlement, to send for more settlers and more weapons from Greenland, and to attempt to subdue the Skrælings by force. The first paragraph of this chapter analyzes the stay and fight option, evaluating its feasibility given the known facts about Norse military capability, Skræling numbers, and the logistical constraints of the transatlantic supply line. The conclusion is clear. Staying would have meant a protracted war of attrition that the Norse could not win, with each casualty irreplaceable and each shipment of supplies a gamble. Karlsefni, as a rational decision-maker, recognized that this option was a path to destruction, not just for the Vinland colony but for the families and the resources that had been committed to it. The second option was to relocate the colony to a more defensible site, perhaps on an offshore island where the Skrælings' skin boats could not easily land, or further south where the indigenous population might be less dense or less hostile. The second paragraph of this chapter evaluates the relocation option, using the saga evidence of exploration to the south and the Bernut finds to reconstruct the geography of the potential relocation sites. Relocation would have addressed the immediate military problem but would have introduced new risks. The unknown terrain, the possibility of encountering an even larger Skræling population, and the loss of the base camp and its accumulated infrastructure. Moreover, relocation would not have solved the fundamental problems of demographic fragility and logistical isolation. It would merely have postponed the reckoning. Karlsefni, who had already explored far to the south, knew that the Skrælings were everywhere, and that there was no empty land to retreat to. The third option was to negotiate a peace with the Skrælings, to establish a formal truce, to offer tribute or hostages, and to create a stable modus vivendi that would allow the Norse to coexist with the indigenous population. The third paragraph of this chapter explores the negotiation option, analyzing the cultural and linguistic barriers that made such a peace nearly impossible. The Norse and the Skrælings lacked any shared framework for diplomacy. They had no common language, no concept of treaties, and no trust. The milk incident had already poisoned the well, convincing the Skrælings that the Norse were treacherous, and the capture of the two Skræling boys would have made forgiveness unthinkable. Even if a truce had been patched together, it would have been fragile, dependent on a level of mutual understanding that either side possessed. Karlsefni, who had experienced the sudden collapse of peaceful trade into war, knew that any peace would be temporary, and that the colony would live in constant fear of the next outbreak. The fourth option, and the one Karlsefni chose, was to withdraw, to load the ships with the valuable timber and furs that had been collected, and to return to Greenland with the colonists, and their livestock intact. The fourth paragraph of this chapter examines the withdrawal option in detail, arguing that it was the least bad choice among a set of terrible alternatives. Withdrawal preserved the lives of the colonists, salvaged a portion of the investment, and avoided the prospect of a catastrophic defeat that could have destroyed the Greenland colony's confidence and resources for a generation. Karlsefni, by choosing withdrawal, demonstrated the kind of strategic prudence that is often undervalued in the heroic narratives of history but that is essential for the survival of small, vulnerable communities. He cut his losses and saved his people, and that decision, though it meant the end of the Vinland dream, was an act of leadership, not of cowardice. The role of the council, the gathering of the leading men to discuss the options, reflects the democratic and consultative traditions of Norse society, where a chieftain could not simply impose his will but had to persuade his followers. The fifth paragraph of this chapter reconstructs the council debate, imagining the voices of the different factions, the young warriors eager for glory, the older farmers concerned for their families, the women like Freydis and Gudrid who had their own perspectives. Karlsefni's task was to build a consensus for withdrawal, to frame the retreat as a strategic repositioning rather than a defeat, and to ensure that the colonists left with their dignity and their cargo intact. The saga's silence on the details of the debate suggests that the decision was ultimately consensual, a collective recognition that the Vinland venture had run its course. The decision to abandon Vinland, while made in a specific moment by specific individuals, was the product of a long chain of events that had narrowed the options until only withdrawal remained. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the decision-making analysis by stating that the Vikings left because they had no good options left, only a choice between bad and worse. Karlsefni's genius was to recognize this reality before it was too late, to accept the limits of his situation, and to act accordingly. The abandonment of Vinland was, in the final analysis, an act of wisdom, a recognition that the dream of a new world colony was a dream that belonged to the future, not to the 11th century. The long-term consequences of the Vinland abandonment for the indigenous peoples of North America were profound and, from an indigenous perspective, largely positive, preserving the demographic and cultural integrity of the continent for another 5 centuries. The first paragraph of this chapter assesses the post-Vinland trajectory of the Native American populations of the Northeast, using archaeological and genetic evidence to trace the development of the eastern woodlands cultures from the 11th to the 15th centuries. The Dorset culture, which likely provided the Skrælings of the initial Vinland encounters, gradually gave way to the Thule Inuit in the Arctic, while the ancestors of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, and other Algonquian peoples continued to thrive in the subarctic and temperate regions. The absence of European contact during this period allowed these societies to develop on their own terms, without the disruptions of disease, displacement, and cultural assault that would come with Columbus. The Skræling victory, in this sense, was a shield that protected the Americas from the full force of Old World expansion for half a millennium. The demographic implications of the Vinland abandonment are particularly striking when considered in light of the catastrophic population declines that followed the Columbian Exchange. The second paragraph of this chapter examines the disease dimension, using estimates of pre-Columbian Native American population, which range from 50 million to 100 million for the entire hemisphere, to underscore what was at stake. Had the Norse succeeded in establishing a permanent colony in Vinland, and had that colony served as a conduit for the introduction of Old World pathogens, smallpox, measles, influenza, and the others, the indigenous population of the Americas might have been devastated centuries earlier, without the subsequent European colonization to exploit the demographic vacuum. The result might have been a partially depopulated but uncolonized continent, a scenario that would have altered the entire course of world history. The Skræling arrows, by driving the Norse away, inadvertently saved millions of Native American lives and preserved the demographic base that would later fuel the great confederacies and nations of the historic period. The political and military consequences of the Vinland abandonment for the indigenous peoples were also significant. The third paragraph of this chapter explores the impact of the Skræling victory on the military traditions of the northeastern peoples, arguing that the successful expulsion of a technologically superior enemy became part of the cultural repertoire of resistance, a precedent that shaped the way later indigenous groups responded to European incursions. The Wabanaki Confederacy, the Iroquois League, and other political formations that emerged in the centuries before Columbus were built on a foundation of sovereignty that had been successfully defended against the first European threat. The Skrælings, in their anonymous, unrecorded victory, established a pattern of indigenous resistance that would echo through the centuries, from King Philip's War to the Plains Indian Wars. The cultural and spiritual consequences of the Vinland encounter for the Skrælings are harder to trace, but they are no less real. The fourth paragraph of this chapter speculates on the impact of the Norse visit on Skræling cosmology and ritual, suggesting that the appearance of the strange, pale beings may have been incorporated into the spiritual narratives of the indigenous peoples, becoming part of the mythic landscape. The bull roarer, the red cloth, the shining metal, all of these may have taken on new meanings, becoming symbols of the encounter and its successful resolution. The oral traditions that we have discussed, with their stories of spirit beings and ancient battles, are the surviving traces of this cultural processing, the way the Skrælings made sense of the incomprehensible and turned it into a story of triumph. The eventual fate of the Skræling peoples, the extinction of the Beotic, the displacement of the Mi'kmaq, the assimilation of the Dorset, is a tragic counterpoint to their Vinland victory. The fifth paragraph of this chapter acknowledges this tragedy, noting that the Skræling triumph in Vinland was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent salvation. The forces that the Skrælings had held at bay in 1000 AD returned with overwhelming power in 1500, and this time, there was no arrow, no bull roarer, no shaman's power that could stop them. The Skræling victory, while real, was limited, and its ultimate meaning must be understood in the context of the long, painful history of indigenous European relations that followed. The Vinland encounter, seen from the indigenous perspective, is a story of agency, resistance, and survival that deserves to be honored and remembered. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the indigenous legacy analysis by stating that the Skrælings, through their courage and their determination, wrote a chapter of history that belongs to the native peoples of the Americas, a chapter that has too often been ignored or overshadowed by the European narrative of discovery. The Vikings left Vinland because the Skrælings made them leave, and that simple fact is the most important legacy of the entire encounter. The Skræling victory is a testament to the power of a people to defend their homeland, a power that no amount of iron or sailcloth can overcome. The modern scholarly consensus on the Vinland abandonment, which has emerged from decades of interdisciplinary research, is that no single factor can explain the failure, but that a combination of military, economic, logistical, environmental, and cultural factors, with the Skræling resistance as the primary catalyst, made the colony unsustainable. The first paragraph of this chapter surveys the major academic works on Vinland, from the early studies of Gustav Storm and Fridtjof Nansen in the late 19th century, through the mid-20th century archaeological discoveries, to the recent syntheses by Birgitta Wallace, Gisli Sigurdsson, and others. The consensus view is that the Vinland colony was a bold but premature venture, a colonial attempt that lacked the necessary state backing, demographic depth, and military force to succeed against a determined indigenous population. The Skrælings, far from being a minor obstacle, were the decisive factor, the variable that turned a difficult but possible colonization into an impossible one. The role of the Skræling resistance in the scholarly literature has, until recently, been understated, partly because of the Eurocentric bias of the sources and partly because of the reluctance to attribute agency to indigenous peoples. The second paragraph of this chapter critiques this historiographical tradition, arguing that the Skrælings have been systematically marginalized in the Vinland narrative, reduced to a nameless, faceless threat rather than being recognized as the central actors they were. The recent work of indigenous scholars and archaeologists, such as the late Patricia Sutherland's research on the Baffin Island contact sites and the re-evaluation of the Dorset and Thule evidence, has begun to correct this imbalance, restoring the Skrælings to their rightful place as the victors of Vinland. The shift in scholarship reflects a broader movement in historical studies toward the recognition of indigenous agency and the decolonization of the past. The economic and logistical arguments, which we have developed at length, are also well represented in the academic literature, though they are often treated as secondary to the military and cultural factors. The third paragraph of this chapter reviews the economic historiography, noting that while the unsustainability of the Vinland colony is widely acknowledged, the relative weight of the different economic factors, the cost of the transatlantic supply chain, the collapse of the walrus ivory market, the competition from African ivory, is still debated. The archaeological evidence from Longhouses meadows, with its smithy and its butternuts, provides a crucial dataset for these debates, grounding the economic models in the physical reality of the site. The consensus is that the Vinland colony was economically marginal at best, and that any shock, a bad winter, a lost ship, a Skræling raid, could tip it into unviability. The environmental and climatic arguments, which have gained traction with the advances in paleoclimatology, add a layer of complexity to the scholarly consensus. The fourth paragraph of this chapter examines the climate literature, discussing the ice core data, the sea ice reconstructions, and the paleobotanical evidence that have been brought to bear on the Vinland question. While the medieval warm period clearly facilitated the initial voyages, the subsequent cooling trend was probably not severe enough by itself to cause the abandonment. Rather, it acted as a background stressor that compounded the other problems. The scholarly consensus treats climate as a contributing factor, not a primary cause, but one that helps to explain why the Norse did not return to Vinland after the initial abandonment. The cultural and psychological factors, while the most difficult to quantify, are increasingly recognized as important elements of the Vinland story. The fifth paragraph of this chapter discusses the cultural historiography, noting that the shift from a Viking hero narrative to a more nuanced understanding of the Vinland settlers as complex, flawed human beings has enriched the scholarly picture. The role of Freydis, the trauma of the Skrælings attacks, the fear and the demoralization, all of these have been taken seriously by recent historians, who see them as essential components of the decision to abandon the colony. The consensus is that the Vinland settlers were psychologically worn down by their experience, and that their decision to leave was as much emotional as it was rational. The future of Vinland research is bright, with new technologies and new perspectives promising to deepen our understanding of the abandonment. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the historiographical survey by looking forward, mentioning the ongoing analysis of ancient DNA from Norse and indigenous remains, the application of LiDAR to search for new sites, and the collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous communities that is reshaping the research agenda. The mystery of why the Vikings left Vinland is not fully solved, and perhaps it never will be, but every year brings new evidence and new insights, and the story of the Skrælings and the Norse continues to evolve. The lessons of Vinland for modern colonial and post-colonial studies are profound, offering a case study in the limits of European expansion and the power of indigenous resistance that resonates far beyond the medieval North Atlantic. The first paragraph of this chapter frames Vinland as a test case for theories of colonialism, arguing that the failure of the Norse colony demonstrates that the European conquest of the Americas was not inevitable, that it depended on specific conditions of technology, disease, and state support that were absent in the 11th century. The Vinland experience shows that indigenous peoples, when they are not decimated by disease and when they are able to mobilize in defense of their lands, can successfully resist even a technologically superior invader. This lesson has been applied by scholars of other colonial encounters, from the Maori resistance to the British in New Zealand to the Apache wars against the United States, providing a comparative framework that enriches our understanding of colonialism as a contingent, contested process. The Vinland story also offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of cultural arrogance and the failure to understand the other. The Norse, with their assumption of superiority and their inability to comprehend the Skræling worldview, blundered into a war that they could not win, a war that could have been avoided if they had approached the Skrælings with humility and respect. The second paragraph of this chapter explores the ethical dimension of the Vinland encounter, using it as a mirror for contemporary issues of cross-cultural communication and conflict resolution. The bull incident, the milk poisoning, the capture of the Skræling boys, all of these were avoidable tragedies, products of a cultural gap that the Norse made no serious effort to bridge. The lesson for modern societies, increasingly interconnected and yet still plagued by cultural misunderstanding, is that listening and learning are the prerequisites for peace. The economic lessons of Vinland, particularly the importance of sustainable development and the dangers of resource extraction without local consent, are equally relevant today. The third paragraph of this chapter applies the Vinland economic model to modern debates about globalization and the exploitation of peripheral regions by distant centers of power. The Norse attempt to extract timber and furs from Vinland without building a mutually beneficial relationship with the Skrælings is a classic example of a resource curse, a pattern that has been repeated in many colonial and neo-colonial contexts. The Skræling resistance, which forced the Norse to abandon their extractive enterprise, can be seen as an early instance of resource sovereignty, a community asserting its right to control its own land and its own resources. The environmental lessons of Vinland, in an age of climate change and ecological crisis, are perhaps the most urgent. The fourth paragraph of this chapter draws parallels between the Norse experience of a changing climate in the North Atlantic and the modern experience of global warming. The Norse, who built their colony on the assumption of a stable climate, were undone when the climate shifted, and their inflexible agricultural system could not adapt. Modern societies, which are built on the assumption of a stable Holocene climate, face a similar challenge, and the Vinland story serves as a warning about the consequences of ecological rigidity. The Skrælings, with their mobile, adaptive way of life, offer a model of resilience that is increasingly relevant as the world confronts the disruptions of the Anthropocene. The psychological lessons of Vinland, the trauma of displacement, and the resilience of the human spirit, are universal human themes that the saga narratives capture with remarkable power. The fifth paragraph of this chapter reflects on the human dimension of the Vinland story, the fear and the courage, the betrayal and the loyalty, the hope and the despair that mark the saga accounts. The Vinland settlers, in their brief, intense experience of a new world, ran the gamut of human emotion, and their story, for all its remoteness in time, speaks directly to the contemporary experience of migration, displacement, and the search for a better life. The Skrælings, for their part, embody the fierce attachment to home and land that is a fundamental human impulse, an impulse that drives resistance to oppression in every age. The Vinland saga is, in the end, a human story, and its lessons are for all of us. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the lessons analysis by stating that the question of why the Vikings left Vinland is not just an academic puzzle but a mirror in which we can see our own struggles, our own failures, and our own hopes. The Norse and the Skrælings, locked in their fatal embrace on the shores of a new world, are our ancestors in spirit if not in blood, and their story is our story, a story of the encounter with the unknown and the search for a way to live together on a shared planet. The future of Vinland research, as we look ahead to the coming decades, is poised at the intersection of new technologies, new perspectives, and a growing recognition of the importance of the Skræling side of the story. The first paragraph of this chapter surveys the technological frontier, including the use of ancient DNA analysis to trace the genetic legacy of the Dorset, Thule, and Beothuk, and to search for possible Norse genetic admixture in indigenous populations. The analysis of sediment cores for environmental DNA, EDNA, holds the promise of identifying the plants and animals that were present at Norse and indigenous sites, providing a much finer-grained picture of the ecological context of the Vinland encounter. The application of LiDAR and satellite-based remote sensing is opening up vast new areas of the Canadian and New England coasts to archaeological survey, increasing the chances of finding a second Norse site or additional indigenous contact sites. The collaboration between academic researchers and indigenous communities is the most important development in Vinland studies, one that is transforming the field from a Eurocentric enterprise into a shared, reciprocal investigation. The second paragraph of this chapter discusses the emerging partnerships between archaeologists and the Inuit, Innu, Mi'kmaq, and other indigenous nations, who are bringing their traditional knowledge, their oral histories, and their perspectives to the interpretation of the material record. These collaborations are not only producing richer, more nuanced understandings of the past but are also contributing to the process of cultural revitalization and healing, as indigenous communities reclaim their ancestors' stories and celebrate their resistance to colonial incursion. The Skrælings, once anonymous and voiceless, are being given back their names and their dignity. The potential discovery of additional Norse sites remains the holy grail of Vinland archaeology, a discovery that would transform our understanding of the scale and duration of the Norse presence. The third paragraph of this chapter speculates on where such a site might be found, using the saga descriptions, the butternut distribution, and the oceanographic modeling to identify the most promising areas for future survey. The southern coast of Newfoundland, the shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the Bay of Fundy are all candidates, and each new field season brings the possibility of a breakthrough. The discovery of a Norse burial, with skeletal remains that could be analyzed for isotopes and DNA, would be a game changer, providing direct evidence of the colonists' diet, health, and genetic origins, and potentially settling the question of whether any Norse individuals were buried in Vinland. The interpretation of the Vinland sagas themselves, as literary texts and as historical sources, continues to evolve. The fourth paragraph of this chapter discusses the current state of saga scholarship, which is increasingly focused on the oral traditions that underlie the written texts, the Christian editorial bias of the 13th century compilers, and the intertextual relationships between the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. New computational techniques, such as stylometry and network analysis, are being applied to the saga corpus, revealing patterns of authorship and influence that were previously invisible. The sagas, for all their familiarity, are still yielding new secrets to the scholars who study them with fresh eyes. The public engagement with Vinland, through museums, documentaries, and popular culture, is an important aspect of the field's future. The fifth paragraph of this chapter examines the ways in which the Vinland story is being presented to the public, from the reconstructed longhouse at Longhouses Meadows to the Vinland Saga anime series, which has introduced millions of viewers to the story. The challenge for public historians is to present the Vinland narrative in a way that is both accurate and engaging, that honors both the Norse and the Skrælings perspectives, and that avoids the old tropes of Viking triumphalism and indigenous savagery. The increasing presence of indigenous voices in museum exhibits and documentary productions is a positive trend that promises to enrich the public understanding of Vinland. The Vinland story, as we have seen, is not a closed chapter but an ongoing conversation, a mystery that continues to inspire research, creativity, and reflection. The sixth paragraph of this chapter concludes the future-oriented analysis by stating that the question of why the Vikings left will continue to be asked, and that each generation will find its own answer, shaped by its own concerns and its own values. The Skrælings, the Norse, and the land they fought over belong to the past, but their story is alive, and it will live as long as there are people who care about the origins of the encounter between the old world and the new. We have journeyed together through the mists of time, from the bustling halls of Brattle to the blood-soaked beaches of Vinland, from the iron forge of Longhouses Meadows to the silent stone walls of Valsey Church in Greenland, and we have asked the question that has haunted historians for 1,000 years: why didn't they stay? The answer, as we have seen, is not a single silver bullet but a volley of arrows, each one striking at a different vulnerability of the Norse colonial project. The Skrælings, with their bows and their bull roars, their intimate knowledge of the land, and their fierce determination to defend their homes, were the primary force that drove the Vikings back into the sea. The vast, stormy Atlantic, which the Norse could cross but could not tame, was the physical barrier that starved the colony of the supplies and the settlers it desperately needed. The fragile Greenland economy, already stretched to the breaking point, could not sustain the drain of a distant, war-torn outpost. The internal betrayals, the murderous ambition of Freydis, the cautious pragmatism of Karlsefni, the unlucky arrow that killed Thorvald, all of these human factors wove together into a tapestry of failure that no amount of Viking courage could unweave. The first paragraph of this final chapter synthesizes all that we have learned, presenting the abandonment of Vinland as a multi-causal event, a perfect storm of challenges that no 11th century society could have withstood. The Vikings left Vinland because Vinland, for all its grapes and timber and salmon, was not a land they could possess. The Skrælings, who had lived on those shores for millennia, made the cost of staying higher than any possible reward. The second paragraph of this chapter pays tribute to the Skræling warriors, whose names we do not know, whose language we cannot speak, but whose victory stands as one of the great indigenous triumphs in the history of human resistance. They did not have iron swords or chainmail, but they had something more powerful: the will to defend their country, and the knowledge of how to use their environment as a weapon. Their arrows, tipped with stone but aimed with deadly precision, changed the course of world history. Because of them, the Americas remained a separate sphere for another 500 years, a vast experimental space where human cultures could evolve in isolation, free from the plagues and the guns of the Old World. The Skrælings victory was a gift of time, and we are all, in ways we may not fully understand, the beneficiaries of that gift. The Norse, for their part, did not leave in shame but in wisdom. Karlsefni, Gudrid, and their companions had the courage to attempt what no one had attempted before, and they had the prudence to retreat when the attempt proved impossible. The third paragraph of this chapter honors the Vinland settlers, not as heroes of a triumphalist saga, but as human beings who faced an unprecedented challenge and made the best decisions they could with the knowledge and resources they had. They dreamed of a new world, and though they could not hold it, they proved that it was there, a green land beyond the Western Sea, waiting for the day when the ships and the men and the money would finally be sufficient to the task. Their story, preserved in the sagas and in the soil of Newfoundland, is a testament to the enduring human impulse to explore, to settle, and to seek a better life. The legacy of Vinland is not a Viking settlement that survived but a meeting of two worlds that failed, and in its failure lies its enduring significance. The fourth paragraph of this chapter reflects on the meaning of the Vinland encounter for our understanding of history and of ourselves. The story of the Norse and the Skrælings is a story of misunderstanding and violence, but it is also a story of courage and resilience on both sides. It reminds us that the past is not a simple tale of progress, with European civilization advancing inexorably across the globe, but a complex, contingent, and deeply human drama, full of missed opportunities, tragic errors, and unexpected outcomes. The Vikings did not stay in Vinland, and because they did not stay, the world we live in is different, more diverse, more indigenous, more shaped by the long, separate evolution of the American hemisphere. As we close this documentary, I want to thank you for embarking on this journey with me, for your curiosity, your attention, and your willingness to dive deep into a story that is often reduced to a footnote in the history books but which, as we have seen, is anything but minor. The Vinland Saga, with its heroes and its villains, its battles and its betrayals, is a story that deserves to be told and retold, not as a celebration of conquest but as an exploration of the human condition. The fifth paragraph here extends an invitation to continue the conversation, to share your thoughts and your theories, and to explore the many other forgotten stories that our channel brings to light. If you enjoyed this content, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the mysteries of our shared past. Your support, your comments, and your engagement are what make this channel possible, so please leave your thoughts below. Tell us which chapter resonated with you most, and what you think was the single most important reason why the Vikings left. The story of Vinland is a story that belongs to all of us, and your voice is a vital part of the ongoing effort to understand it. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.